Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Hammersmith and Fulham's full council meeting. And I'd like to say welcome to all our guests who are watching this evening on the live stream on YouTube. My name's Councillor PJ Murphy. I'm the Mayor of the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, and I'm going to be chairing tonight's meeting. This is our first hybrid meeting where councillors will be contributing both from home and also here in the chamber. And so members will be able to fully participate on special motions. Voting on special motions will be through the whip unless a member decides to vote differently. Unfortunately, under current legislation, councillors contributing from home can't speak or vote on decision reports. Tonight we have 6 decision reports. Those are items 6.1 to 6.6. And on those, only people within the chamber can vote. By participating in tonight's meeting, you're consenting to being recorded. Please be aware that if your microphone is unmuted, our viewers will be able to hear every word you say. And so if your camera is on, please assume you're being broadcast to YouTube, to your family, friends, electors, to peruse at leisure and in perpetuity. So as this is our first hybrid meeting, we really need to try and make it run smoothly. So to help that happen, please keep your microphones muted when you're not speaking. If the whip has not provided me with your name and you wish to speak, please raise your hand or use the raise hand facilities on Zoom and wait until I call you. If you wish to raise a point of standing order, please raise your hand or use the raised hand facility, and I'll invite you to speak at a suitable point. When called to speak or please state the standing order you wish to utilise. Please wait patiently and don't interrupt the person speaking. If you wish to raise a point of order or personal explanation, you may then interrupt the councillor speaking. However, please ensure your points are factual, brief and to the point. For the councillors joining us on Zoom, it's great to see you there, and please keep your cameras on throughout the meeting unless you're having connection issues. If you do have connection issues, please email David Abbott and he'll be able to help you to resolve them. For members in the chamber, when you're speaking, please address the camera in front of you, directly in front of you. And please be seated when speaking, a bit of a change from normal. If you stand up, unfortunately, you'll look as if you've been decapitated, which is great for Halloween, but not so great for our council meeting. So please, when you speak, remain seated. And also, please, members in the chamber, please wear your masks unless you are speaking. I also ask members to keep their speeches brief and to the point, and a timer will be in operation. I'll indicate when you have a minute left, and again when your time is up. For those of you that are in the meeting, please remember that when the traffic light is on amber, you have less than 1 minute to speak. When it turns red, please stop your speech. Yeah, have you got the... Okay, the traffic lights are stalled, so I'll give you a minute's notice and then we'll go along that way. If you're watching at home and would like to follow along with the agenda, there's a link in the description on YouTube. Finally, we'd just like to welcome you all back in the chamber and also online. And I think we're all looking forward to this first council meeting in this sense. And hopefully we're going to have a really enjoyable evening. So we move straight on to item 1, and I turn over to our Chief Executive, Kim Smith.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kim Smith, and I'm the Chief Executive. Good to welcome you all back for an in-person meeting. Item number 1 is apologies for absence. We have apologies for absence received from Councillors Johnson and Macmillan, and we have apologies for lateness from Councillor Colhane and Councillor Alford. Thank you.
We move on to item 2.
I'm actually here and have been for some time.
Thank you very much, Councillor Alford. Yeah, we missed you. My apologies. Welcome. So item 2, declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? No. Item 3, the minutes. Is it the wish of the council that I sign the annual council meeting minutes held on the 28th of April 2021 and the minutes of the informal council meeting held on the 14th of July 2021? Thank you very much indeed. Mayor's announcements. So the first one is really quite lovely. It's a congratulations to councillors Leighton and Connell on the birth of their first child, Phoebe. So yeah, wonderful. And we wish you all the joy and wisdom that the joy of parenthood we wish you all the joy and wisdom that parenthood's going to bring you. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to Phoebe, running out before a packed Millennium Stadium, proudly wearing her Welsh rugby shirt. It's going to be a great thing to see. Sadly, though, I do have to move on to the death of David Amess, and it's with great sadness that we note the tragic murder of Sir David. He was a Conservative MP for the South West, and he'd been an MP since 1963, married with 5 children. He was a committed public servant, a champion for Scotland, and I know we were all shocked by his murder. I call on the leader of the council to say a few words.
I apologise for sitting down, Mayor. I'm instructed to do so, so it's by no means any disrespect, as is necessitated by the video. I think I speak for everybody in the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, and certainly everybody who has been elected to this chamber, in expressing our sincerest grief and best wishes to his family, to the family of Sir David Amess, MP. The attack on Sir David Amess was not an attack on a Conservative MP. It was an attack on all MPs, all elected representatives, and the very foundation of what this aged democracy of ours has been built on. Whilst I don't think any of us would purport to agree with each other on everything, and certainly there are many differences many of us would have had with Sir David on issues, all of us would defend his right to express those issues, to be elected, and to go about his business fairly and safely without any threat to himself. And that's unfortunately not what happened. He was attacked brutally, later listed as a terrorist incident, and died in the course of his duties in the most heinous way I think any of us could have imagined. And there's something fundamentally dangerous about that, because whilst in the past there have been many attacks and murders of famous parliamentary people, when you look at the context of this popularist age, where we see only 2 years ago riots on the Hill of the United States, where Congress was taken over by thugs, you saw prior to that the disgraceful murder by a right-wing neo-fascist of Joe Cox MP, and across the world we see many other aspects of an undermining of the right of people and their elected representatives to go about their business. So I think this is a time when all of us stand together, when all of us say this must stop, and all of us work progressively to make sure that the forces behind these disgusting approaches, these disgusting murders, attacks, are put to where they belong in the annals of history. On a personal note, I did not know Sir David, but I do know he started life as a teacher, a noble profession dedicated to bringing the next generation into society, and part of that is in bringing them into British society with all the understanding of how our civic life works. And after that, he had many different jobs before becoming an MP, where he was re-elected time after time because he served his constituents. And there is something uniquely positive about the British system, where a member of parliament or a councillor has a geographical location and people know that the person they elected will represent them and is accessible to them. That is a sacred thing. If you look in any aspect of the history books, it is also an anomaly and an unusual thing. And so with that note, I would simply say this. It stops here. Everybody who stands for elected office has a duty to do what they can to bring this country together, to bring communities together, and to find a different way of arranging our disagreements. And for Sir David, I think we say on behalf of everyone in Hammersmith and Fulham, thank you for your service to our country. Thank you for your service to your community. And we are deeply sorry this has happened to you, and to his family. We send our deepest possible love and respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Fowler.
On Friday at lunchtime last week, Sir David Amos MP was brutally stabbed and killed whilst at his regular constituency surgery. This shocking murder of an MP whilst doing his job has affected us all. He was an MP for nearly 40 years. He served his constituency with care and dedication. He was a backbench MP of tremendous calibre. He was assiduous and likeable. He was a popular man and above all kind. It was a very touching and emotional occasion in the House of Commons on Monday when his fellow MPs came together to remember his life. It was heartwarming to listen to the warm, kind words from everyone on all sides of politics. It was also clear that everyone was also thinking of the dreadful murder of Joe Cox MP in 2016. Another tragedy which will never be forgotten either. Sir David was a committed Christian, a Roman Catholic, who campaigned vigorously yet reasonably on those subjects which mattered to him most. He was diligent in his attendance at local events in his Southend West constituency. I particularly applaud his campaign for faster and better treatment of endometriosis. Tragically, he died doing the job he loved, meeting residents in order to help them. He was well known for his smile and sense of humour, always managing to work into every speech his beloved constituency. His constant refrain over 20 years was his request to have Southend declared a city. And it gives us all some peace of mind that Her Majesty the Queen has felt fit to declare city status upon Southend, now the 52nd city in the UK. It was a cruel end to a life of service, and he leaves a widow, Julia, Lady Amos, and 5 adult children, 4 daughters and a son. We offer our sincere condolences and love to them in their grief. May he rest in peace. Amen.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any other speeches?
Mr. Mayor.
Yes, please, Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and apologies that I couldn't be with you in person this evening, as you might have been able to guess from my Donald Duck-esque voice. I'm struggling with allergy that I wouldn't want to pass on to colleagues in the chamber. Thankfully not COVID, however. Can I first thank the Leader of the Council and my good friend, the Leader of the Opposition, for their very well-spoken speeches regarding the tragic death of Sir David. My speech is slightly more personal. I knew Sir David, not very well, but he was someone that I'd worked with professionally on healthcare causes over 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And of all the MPs that I've engaged with in Parliament, championing healthcare causes, whatever they might be, Sir David was probably by far the most assiduous, the most interested, the most dedicated at chasing up ministers with regards to responses to his letters. And he always wanted to go above and beyond. You know, when, for those in a similar career to me who engage with parliamentarians, you often, look for one or two things that they might be able to do to help raise awareness of an issue, whether it's ask some written questions or sign an early day motion or even write to the minister, whatever it might be. David would always ask what else he could do. And when he'd done that, he'd ask, what more can I do? And some of the things that, he supported, such as improved access to prosthetics for both the knee amputees. He really laid his heart and soul and passion into those campaigns. And, he also had, as people have said in the speeches this evening, but also in the memorials to him over the last few days, an incredible sense of humour and kindness. And I remember on one occasion where, for happenstance, I ended up seeing him in the morning for one cause, and then in the afternoon for another. And with the most good-humoured and kind and gentle way, he kind of played a practical joke on me because of it, but at no point letting slip to the charity who I was with what had happened. And him and I had have had several drinks and jokes about that over the years at party conferences, and I saw him briefly in Manchester a few weeks ago, and it is truly shocking what happened to him. And I think it's something that we all reflect on, like we all reflected on the dreadful murder of Joe Cox. And it's something that we must do whatever we can to try and prevent. But I think ultimately there needs to be far greater security for members of Parliament and also councillors and all elected representatives. And we need to have far less tolerance for hateful behaviour towards our elected representatives, whether it's in the media, in social media, or in person. And it's something that only by having zero tolerance for that kind of behaviour can we ensure that tragic events such as this don't happen again. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor Brown. And are there any other speakers? No? Okay, we'll now pause for 1 minute silent reflection on the life of Sir David. Thank you all very much. Thank you. We now move on to item 5, which is public questions. And I'd like to thank all the residents who took time to submit questions to tonight's meeting, and we've received quite a lot this month. Public questions is limited to 20 minutes. And as we have a full agenda, unfortunately, it can't be extended. If a question doesn't receive a reply tonight, a written response will be sent and published in the next minutes. All the questioners called will have an opportunity to ask a follow-up question. And to allow as many questions as possible, can I ask, please, that you avoid the temptation to make a speech and just ask a brief and pointed follow-up question. Thank you very much. Question number 1 is on the TCPR and the commitments on health and traffic reduction. And that is from, I invite Nick Smith to ask his question to Councillor Wesley Harcourt. Is Mr. Smith here or on Zoom? No. All right, then I'm sorry, Mr. Smith, we will send you a written response. Our second questioner has requested a written response, and so we move on to question number 3, which is from Nicola Dryden, and I ask her to ask her question to Councillor Wesley Harcourt. Nicola, are you on Zoom? All right, sorry, Nicola. Again, we'll answer your question and send you on a written reply. Question 4 is on the proposed Western expansion, and I invite Carlos Letterback to ask his question to Councillor Wesley Harcourt. Carlos, are you on Zoom this evening? So again, we will have a written response to you, as we will on our 5th and 6th questions. So we move on to question 7, and I invite Andy Knowles to ask his question to Councillor Wesley Harcourt. Andy,
good evening, everybody.
Good evening, Andy. Please go ahead with your
Yes.
question. You're our first one tonight.
I have all night then. Right, I'll get on. The traffic congestion and pollution reduction scheme appears to residents in Southend East, of which I'm one, to have been a great success in its aims of reducing traffic congestion and pollution. For example, with queues now very rarely seen stretching back past the pedestrian entrance to Sainsbury's. Can the council provide actual data to confirm what we're seeing ourselves?
I invite the Cabinet Member to respond.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, Mr. Knowles. Thank you very much for coming along tonight, albeit on Zoom, for asking your question. It's really nice to have somebody actually ask the question with the other previous questioners not being able to get in for whatever reason. It's been a long time working on this particular issue over the years, and I'd like to thank all those residents, hundreds of residents who've participated, and also my colleague, Councillor Ben Coleman behind me, who's done so much for this. But getting to your particular question about the traffic reduction, I really do appreciate your comments and the many other comments that we've had as councillors. Our traffic survey data continuously monitors traffic levels in the area, and it actually correlates with your observation. And we've seen a reduction of traffic on Bagley's Lane, Imperial Road, Townmead Road of 72%, 77% and 56% respectively. In addition, there's been a net reduction of the total traffic volumes on Wandsworth Bridge Road, something like 12% on Wandsworth Bridge Road, and further reductions on the other side in Broomhouse Lane and Peterborough Road, reductions of some 19%. If you then work this out in terms of carbon reduction, it amounts to something in the region of over a tonne of CO2 per day.
Thank you, Councillor. And Mr. Knowles, do you have a follow-up question?
No, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Knowles. I now invite Gary Fainin to ask his question, again to Councillor Wesley Harcourt. Gary, are you here this evening on Zoom?
Yes, thank you very much. Hello.
Good evening.
So the Wandsworth Bridge Road is one of the only roads leading to a bridge crossing in London, still at 30 miles per hour. Sat-navs prioritize roads first based on speed limit, and then secondly on traffic volumes. This leads to the Wandsworth Bridge Road being prioritized above all other bridge crossings for many through commuters, which leads to more and unnecessary congestion. I understand the council conducted a consultation on 20 miles an hour some years ago, and the public didn't have strong opinions either way. So therefore, can we please give us an indication when the Wandsworth Bridge Road can have a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit urgently implemented to help create a level playing field with other bridge crossings? to help deter commuting through traffic.
Thank you, councillor. And can I ask, if we do speak in the chamber, that we speak quite loudly, because people listening in are finding it difficult to hear us?
Okay, well, do tell me if I'm not speaking loudly enough, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for your question, Mr. Fannin, and thank you also for the amount of time and effort you've put in over the last year, 18 months or whatever, into the work on the traffic reduction scheme in this particular area. In terms of your actual question, I think we can confirm that the introduction of a 20-mile-per-hour speed limit on Wandsworth Bridge Road is something that's going to be considered at Cabinet. In fact, it's something that I've been discussing recently with highways officers, and have asked them to contact TfL as you know, it's a key link road, and TfL therefore have an input into this decision to go ahead and see what we can do to get a 20-mile-per-hour limit put in there as soon as possible. You may be interested to know that the statistics that have come out show that Wandsworth Bridge Road, there's been, albeit a minor reduction, there's been a 2-mile-per-hour reduction in speed on Wandsworth Bridge Road from an average of 21 miles per hour down to 19 miles per hour.
Thank you very much, councillor. And Gary, do you have a follow-up question?
Yes, if I might, please. Thank you. So thank you also for the statistics on the speed reduction that's already in place. As anyone in the area knows, that once the congestion leaves during the day, in the evenings, the speed tends to increase, with a lot of vehicles barreling down this very straight road. So if we have the 20 miles an hour enforced, could we have enforcement cameras and also acoustic cameras, which are being trialed in Kensington and Chelsea at the moment for the particularly noisy cars and motorbikes?
Yeah, thank you for that follow-up question. Yes, indeed. I mean, obviously, the figures I've just quoted to you are very much the average ones for the daytime. And as soon as we reach sort of 6, 7 o'clock after the rush hour, then traffic speeds do go up considerably. And therefore, that's one of the reasons, and given the comments made by yourself and other residents in the area, why I was quite keen to get move forward on the 20-mile-per-hour speed limit on Wandsworth Bridge Road. Speed cameras and such like are all down to Transport for London, but certainly we would like to get that in. There's no point in having a speed limit if it's not going to be enforced. We haven't used the acoustic speed cameras in this borough. I am aware that they're used in, I believe, Kensington and Chelsea. But it's certainly something that I'm quite happy to go away and ask officers to look into as a possible use. You know, this scheme and with the use of cameras and other things in this particular scheme has been quite innovative. And so using a system such as that would seem to me to augment the current system in place.
Thank you very much, councillor.
Thank you.
Just before we move on, can I just see if if Nick Smith, Nicola Dryden or Carlos Ledback have managed to join us yet? If you have, could you just let us know? We can then ask your question. All right. So that's the end of public questions then. And the questions that weren't asked this evening will receive written responses, and they will be published in the minutes. We now move on to the committee report, which is item 6. And these are decision reports. So just a reminder that only those in the chamber can speak and vote on them. Okay. Item 6.1 is the result of the local government by-election on the 23rd of September 2021. And I'd like to congratulate Councillor Frances Hume on her election and welcome her to her first council meeting tonight. I know that everyone will have told you, and you're going to be hearing it a lot, I'm afraid, that following on from Colin, you're going to have a tough act to follow. But I'm sure that on behalf of all of us here from both parties, we wish you all the very best of luck, and I'm sure you'll do Colin and your residents proud. Congratulations. And I'd like to invite the leader of the council, Stephen Cowan, to speak on this item.
Well, only to say that Colin is a very hard act to follow. He is still extremely missed by all the residents, but I know he's an atheist, and therefore I will not retort to anything that would upset his value system. But I know if he could be looking from anywhere, he'd be extremely proud to see Francis Umay replace him as a councillor for the area he loved so much and dedicated over 40 years of his life to, either as a school governor, as an elected councillor, or on all the many different committees he sat and worked on. So I think it's an honour to be elected, to be a representative. It touches a little bit on the last point we made. It's a historical anomaly to find yourself in this situation, but Francis has already made us proud and will go on to do so.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any other speeches? Councillor Booker McFowler.
From the Conservative side, I'd like to congratulate you very much, Francis, now Councillor Umay, on your election success in Wormholt and White City. You've taken on two of the most important roles. It's coming up shortly in planning and licensing. So taking Colin's exact positions, one day perhaps you'll be Chief Whip as well. But many congratulations.
Watch out, Councillor Corn. Yeah. Okay, sorry, Councillor, you had your hand up? Okay, sorry. Are there any other speeches? All right. Is the report on the results of the by-election noted? Thank you. Item 6.2, allocations of seats and proportionality on committees. Is the report on the allocation of seats proportionality on committees noted? Thank you. 6.3, party appointments for the 2021-2022 municipal year. Is the report and circulated amendment on the appointments made by the party groups to the council for the 2021-22 year noted? Thank you. Congratulations, Councillor Cornwall. Yeah. You have more hair than Colin. Yeah. Item 6.4, committee membership changes. I call on the leader of the council, Councillor Cowan, to move the report with the table amendments and recommendations.
Formally moved.
Are there any speakers on this report? No. Is the report and its recommendations agreed? The recommendations are carried. Review of the Constitution. Is the report noted? Thank you. Dispensation report. I call upon the leader, Councillor Cowan, to move the report and recommendations.
Formally moved.
Are there any speakers on this report? Okay. Is the report and its recommendations agreed? The recommendations are carried. We now move on to item 7, special motions. Just a reminder that all members can fully participate in the following items, and voting will be through the whips. Special motion 1, the Green Agenda. I call on Councillor Andrew Brown and Matt Thorley to move and second. Councillor Brown?
Formally moved, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Thorley?
Formally seconded. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call on Councillor Brown, followed by Councillor Thorley, to speak for the opposition, and you have 5 minutes to speak each.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think the Green Agenda is something that we have spoken on in this chamber, albeit our real council chamber, several years ago when the council declared a climate emergency. But I think since then, the facts with regard to climate change and its impact on not just our country, but countries and peoples around the world, and perhaps even more significantly so on wildlife and ecosystems and all the things that are so powerfully portrayed to us by campaigners such as Sir David Attenborough, Greta Thunberg, and others. And I don't know if anyone else has been watching His Royal Highness the Duke of Cambridge's Earthshot campaign recently. But I think we're at a point in history where it is now beyond doubt that there is climate change. It's beyond doubt that it is primarily caused by human activity. Clearly, the the release of carbon into the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels and other human activity. And it's now clear that if we don't do something about it, then the consequences for perhaps not ourselves, but for our children, our grandchildren, and those that come after us, not to mention the millions of species that depend on a stable climate for their survival, we will all be, far worse off. But bringing that back to this borough, with COP26 quickly approaching, I think there's a huge opportunity for leaders around the world to really step up and make the changes that are necessary. But from within Hammersmith and Fulham, despite there being cross-party support for the council calling a climate emergency, and there have been things that the council have done since then to improve Hammersmith and Fulham's impact on the climate and impact on air quality and all the things that go alongside it. We as an opposition don't feel that a sufficient pace or scope has been given to the measures needed to make the changes that are necessary. We firmly believe that sustainability and making these changes that will not just make our residents' homes and businesses and their vehicles more efficient and cleaner and greener, but can also create a huge number of high quality, highly skilled jobs, and really make a huge difference to not just the climate emergency, but also the lives and well-beings of our residents. So, as speaking on behalf of the opposition, we believe firmly that the council needs to reinvigorate what it's trying to achieve with regard to making good on its promises with regard to the climate emergency, and bring forward more radical and more significant proposals in order to meet those goals. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Oh, thank you very much, Councillor, indeed. I now move on to Councillor Thorley.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The council unanimously agreed a motion in 2019 which declared a climate emergency in Hammersmith and Fulham. In the same year, the government adopted a net zero carbon emission target for 2050, making it the first major economy to pledge to cut emissions to close to zero. The target will require the UK to bring all greenhouse gas emissions to virtually zero by 2050, compared with the previous target of an 80% reduction. It will also trigger a profound economic shift in the country that was once the largest coal consumer in the world. The cost of reaching net zero is debated, but many approximate it will be 1 to 2% of gross domestic product annually, according to a report from the Committee on Climate Change, the government advisory body whose study recommended that the UK government strengthen its target. Reaching the new goal will not be easy, as the country will have to wean itself off fossil fuels, including natural gas, diesel and petrol. This council will have a vital role to play in this endeavour, with a critical role in facilitating and supporting change within our community. One of the biggest challenges we face in H&F is heating. This is one of the most difficult areas to decarbonise. More than 80% of UK dwellings are heated by natural gas, the largest contributor to the near 15% of UK greenhouse emissions that come from homes. Indeed, the council's own data demonstrates how significant an impact the heating of homes has on pollution levels locally. I'm aware that the new pollution monitor cameras in South Fulham recorded significant spikes in pollution levels in November and December last year. However, these spikes were not linked to increased traffic movements, but rather the impact of people putting up their heating during the cold winter. The government has ruled that from 2025, gas boilers can no longer be fitted in new homes, which must instead be built with heat pumps that absorb or extract heat from outside or in the ground and run on electricity. But for older homes, a scalable solution it will be needed. One option is local heat networks, where hot water is provided from a central renewable source. An alternative is to replace natural gas with hydrogen as part of a broader utilisation of the fuel. This could use much of the existing gas infrastructure, but would be much more expensive. As a council, we should be thinking ahead now about what infrastructure we need to put in place to enable people to make the transition from their current gas boilers to new models. It is highly likely that the majority of people will need to replace their boilers between now and 2050, but we need to put in the infrastructure in place to support these new boilers now to enable residents to make the transition as easy as possible. Another area the council can support residents is in transport. As other sectors have decarbonised, transport has grown to become the UK's single largest source of greenhouse gases, accounting for 28% of emissions, mostly from cars. Even though vehicles have become more efficient, demand has increased as the population has grown. The Committee on Climate Change has warned that the existing target for ending the sale of diesel and petrol vehicles by 2040 will need to be moved forward to at least 2035 to reach the net zero goal. Doing that will require more charging points and greater availability of electric cars. I acknowledge the Council has made progress in installing new charging points, but I would urge them to redouble their efforts in this area. We should be working with local communities to identify as many sites as possible for these charging points. Once we have agreed the most suitable locations, we should ensure that we have a plan to deliver them as soon as possible, and as importantly, identify what barriers there may be to implementing any such sites. The Council must act as a facilitator, not a roadblock to change. It is vital for future generations that we stick to our commitment to become carbon neutral by 2050. Achieving this will not be easy, and it will require all of us to make significant changes to the way we currently live our lives.
Sorry, Councillor, you have 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. If we engage and support our residents, our businesses, and other key local stakeholders, I'm confident we can get there. However, this will be contingent on engaging properly with local residents so that they buy into what we are all trying to achieve. If we can do this and ensure we put in place the necessary support for residents, we will make the transition so much easier and smoother for our community. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor. An amendment has been submitted for the motion, and I call on Councillors Harcourt and Cowan to move and second the motion. Second the amendment, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Formally moved.
Formally seconded.
I call on Councillor Harcourt, followed by Councillor Cowan, to speak for the administration.
Again, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, I'm pleased to
Mayor.
be moved.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, it's point of order, really. For those of us who are attending remotely, is there any way we can actually see the amendments that are submitted?
Yes, I'm sorry.
I've got to know whether we can speak to them, whether we need to speak to them or not.
Yes, I'm sorry. I thought they had been circulated. We should get them to you. Let me just check, please. Sorry, they have been circulated, Councillor.
Well, obviously I haven't had them, but that's probably a difficulty at my end for some reason.
Okay.
Right, thank you. I'm grateful for that, Mayor.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, sorry, Councillor. Please
No,
start again. Yeah?
no problem. I think it's obviously important everybody gets a chance to see the amendment. So anyway, as I was saying, I was pleased to move this. There's a number of points in the original motion that I wanted to address. And I think it's time we had a mature debate on climate change, and a meaningful one, rather than a chance for making a political sideswipe at this administration, as some of the points
Sorry,
in the
Councillor,
original.
could you speak a little bit closer to the microphone?
Some
Thank
of
you.
the points in the original motion seem to be. I think it should rather be a chance for us to recognise the work that this council is doing around climate change. You'll recall that we declared a climate emergency at council in 2019, and we set the borough a target of being net carbon zero by 2030, not 2050, as per the government target. Since then, we've seen graphic reminders of the effects of climate change. Just look at the floods that there were in Henan province in China in July, when the trains were flooded with passengers clinging on for dear life, water up to their necks. Again in Shaanxi province just a few days ago, with reports of 300 people dead. Then we had the devastating floods in Germany, Belgium, and other parts of Europe earlier this year that destroyed properties and towns and villages. More locally, there's been flooding in Knightsbridge, our own borough, as a result of torrential rain. record temperatures in West America and also in Canada, wildfires in Australia, California, and even in the UK on Saddleworth Moor in 2019. These events are becoming increasingly frequent and more intense, and they only look set to worsen as climate change continues apace. It's imperative that we take a lead with action now and not just leave things to go at a pace dictated by others. In the words of David Attenborough, we don't have eternity. We need to do this now and over the next 10 years. He believes we can do it, and so do we. We heard just last week, both Prince Charles and the Duke of Cambridge commenting that talking is not enough and that we need action. Well, we began by involving residents in the Climate and Ecological Emergency Commission that reported in February this year. Their comments has fed into the strategy developed by our climate unit, and we recognise the need for action. And so we've established a climate strategy implementation group, again led by residents Helen Dell and Chris Dodwell, the latter being a local resident and a climate change expert. We're looking at how we implement each of the 5 climate change challenges in the strategic plan in turn. Obviously, bringing residents along with us is essential, getting them to understand how they can help support and be part of the strategy. Change of any sort can be controversial, as we all know. And so it's about getting a shared vision with residents and businesses if we're going to bring about the changes needed to reach our target. But enough talk. What have we actually done? Over the coming weeks, we have a programme of over 48 events, lectures, workshops and such like in our climate carnival in the lead up to COP26, which we certainly hope will inform and enthuse residents and businesses alike. I hope everybody here is booked onto a number of those. We have one of the largest networks of electric vehicle charging points across London and in the country, with over 1,000 going to be in place by the end of this year. Increasing the numbers of electric vehicles and moving away from fossil fuel power is one of our key planks in reducing climate change. Reducing traffic helps. As a result of the South Fulham TCPR, as I was saying in response to one of the questioners earlier, we have now the only area in the borough that is below the World Health Organization target for air quality. This reduction alone translates, as I said earlier, into a reduction of over a tonne of carbon every day. With the last mile cargo bike delivery service, electric van delivery service, both reducing the carbon footprint of delivery services locally. We're retrofitting a number of properties in the West Kensington estate by increasing insulation and energy efficiency to carbon zero. This is the wonderfully named Energy Sprong project.
1 minute, councillor.
Thank you. We have implemented SUD schemes, sustainable drainage schemes across the borough, Bridget Joyce Square, which won an award, Melina Road, Queen Caroline's estate, and more. These are part of our greening of the grey strategy and improving ecology within the borough. Sadly, and Mr. Mayor, thank you for reminding me of the shortage of time. I don't have enough time to list everything that we're doing, but the climate emergency is with us and we're all feeling the effects. We need to act now. And if I can dare to paraphrase the words of Greta Thunberg, we cannot afford another 30 years of blah, blah, blah.
Thank you very much, councillor. Councillor Cowan.
I reserve my right to speak. I'll reserve my right to speak.
Thank you very much. I have been informed that Councillor Cassidy, Councillor Ume and Councillor Stanton wish to speak, so I'll go straight to Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've been told to stand up, actually, to appear on camera. I wouldn't want to deny you my handsome face, nor the members of the public watching out there on YouTube. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Sorry, can I just interrupt on that one? It's the people at the back that have to stand up so you can see their handsome faces.
Not just me, not just me.
Those at the front can remain seated for us to see their handsome faces, but please, Mr. Stein, you can start again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Climate change is real. Climate change is man-made. I think we've moved beyond the point where any reasonable politician, locally or nationally, denies that point or chooses to deny it in public. What they say in private is possibly a different matter. We've also moved beyond the point where there is any doubt as to the catastrophic impact of climate change and what it will have on the planet if we do not take immediate, robust action to reduce our carbon emissions. But as we move away from the discourse of climate denial, We find that the arguments used to downplay or discount the need for action have changed. Instead of climate denial, we now face the issue of climate delay. These are the arguments, the strategies that move us away from action, bog us down in deadlock and endless debate, or that create a sense that there are immovable obstacles that prevent change, and they slow us down. As Bill McKibben, the environmentalist and climate scholar, says on climate change, winning slowly is the same as losing. Time is not on our side here. To deal with climate change requires a level of coordinated action on the part of government, business, civil society that is unprecedented. But this is not a council of despair. When we look at what happened in Hammersmith and Fulham and nationally in response to the COVID pandemic, community groups springing up, working with each other, working with the NHS, with local government to fight the virus, it gives us hope that we can replicate this, take the coordinated action necessary to fight climate change. But for us as councillors, for all elected representatives, it requires us to be honest, truthful about the issues we face and the solutions needed. We must work against climate delay. Some of these solutions will require us to make changes to our lives. When we pretend that these changes are not necessary, we're engaging in climate delay. Matt Hancock talks excitedly about electric planes being a potential in the not too distant future. In the future, we won't be flying less, holidays will be the same. This rhetoric of technological solutions that are always just over the horizon, and they'll save us without us requiring to make any changes. This is the rhetoric of climate delay. When a West London Tory Assembly member claims that an SUV is an essential, often essential for living in West London, rather than being honest and saying that it's a luxury purchase with a huge carbon footprint, this is a rhetoric of climate delay. It's the rhetoric of climate delay is to criticise proposed solutions without offering alternatives, endlessly discussing the negative impacts without realising that by delaying action, any negative impacts will be far more significant, whether on the economy, business or people's lives. It would be easy and enjoyable to take endless pot shots at statements made by opposition politicians, but it's an issue where party politics must take a back seat. We must be willing to praise and support the government when it is deserved. I will praise what Andrew Gilligan has done in the Department for Transport, putting active travel at the top of the agenda. There is lots of other good work being done, but overall we have a government that's not taking the action necessary. The Climate Change Committee has stated that government needs to step up rapidly if it's to meet its targets. It scored at 9 out of 10 for targets, but only 4 out of 10 for delivery. We do our constituents a disservice if we do not acknowledge the scale of what we need to do. We let them down if we're not honest enough to say that our lives will need to change in some ways. Nationally, Labour has committed 28 billion every year until 2030. Labour is saying that a temperature rise of 1.5 degrees must be our target. We must not let it get to 2 degrees. Locally in Hammersmith and Fulham, Wesley's, Councillor Harcourt's listed many of the things that we've done, the Climate Emergency Commission. Locally, we've just won an award from the London Cycling Campaign for our work with disabled people on building infrastructure and involving them in the building of infrastructure right from the word go.
Councillor, you have 1 more minute.
Thank you. This is an example of what a Labour council can do. Local government must play a key role in tackling climate change, but it is national government behind us. When it's continuing with its road and runway building programme, when Department for Transport reports make no mention of reducing car use, simply hand-waving the issue away, saying that we'll all be driving electric cars, this is the rhetoric of climate delay. I ask the opposition to work with us in this. We need to challenge the government because at the moment, the action is falling short and the rhetoric still suggests that many within government do not get the scale of what is necessary and what action we will need to take. I would ask the opposition to support the amendment on this and work with us to challenge the government to make sure that we are getting the support that we need to take the action necessary in Hammersmith and Fulham. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I call on Councillor Ume to speak, and please note this will be Councillor Francis Ume's maiden speech and the protocols around that. Councillor Ume.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And can I also say a heartfelt thank you to the people of Wormholt and White City, many who I know and grew up with, who elected me to be their councillor on the 23rd of September this year. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be called to speak here this evening on such an important issue, the green agenda. However, it is upsetting to be called to speak in the particular circumstances that brought me here. The sad death of our very dear friend, Councillor Colin Ahern. Colin was a formidable man. Someone who took great pride in his work, someone who served our community for most of his adult life, someone who was a fierce champion for social justice. Colin was a family friend for as long as I can remember. He was always optimistic, always positive. When he was in hospital a few months ago, I messaged him and I wanted to check in and I told him to get better. And Colin messaged back as quick as a flash, swift to show his appreciation. Moments later, my phone rang. It was Colin. He was calling to apologize for spelling my name wrong. And that was just exactly who Colin was. He was always kind, always considerate, always thinking of others. How does anyone follow in Colin's footsteps? It's impossible, really. But I will try to do my best to live up to his example by caring for our constituents, defending and furthering their interests, being diligent and trying always to do the right thing. As I said, I'm extremely grateful to the residents of Wormholt and White City, and I recognize it's a rare opportunity to be able to represent a community where I was born, I went to school, and I'm still very active in today. When I was canvassing, it was fantastic to meet people and discuss the issues that mattered most to them. So we talked about things such as housing and safety and education, employment and the environment, and what the future holds. Thanks again to everyone for the discussions and the support. I will do my best for the 13,000 plus individuals within this community, working with them, with our officers and with councillors to make a difference. We have a fantastic group of councillors in our borough, and it's a privilege to be a part of the Hammersmith and Fulham Labour Group. So I also want to give special thanks to all the councillors for the support during the campaign, with a special mention to our leader, Councillor Stephen Cowan, also to councillors Max Schmid and Larry Culhane, as well as our MP Andy Slaughter, and of course my family. I also want to recognise, since starting this amazing opportunity, how welcoming the wonderful officers have been and fellow councillors, and it's just going to be wonderful to work with everyone to really make a difference. I'm confident together with residents we can really do a good deal in order to make sure that the community thrives. And I think one of the most important ways that we can make sure the community thrives is to ensure that we have a clean, safe and green borough. Now, we know that the climate crisis is a really important issue that people within our community are facing. And you've already heard this evening about how our council is leading a determined response. Councillors Wesley Harcourt and Councillors Ian Cassidy have discussed this already. They've shared the fact that we have declared a climate emergency and this ambition to reach carbon net zero emissions by 2030. And there's so much more that we're doing in partnership with residents, and thinking about travel, thinking about consumption, thinking about where we invest our fossil fuels, and not just thinking, acting, doing. We've already heard about it this evening.
Councillor, you have one more minute.
Thank you. 2 weeks ago, performing one of my first duties as councillor, I had the opportunity to declare a climate panel at Our Lady of Fatima Parish Church. And I give thanks to Father Richard, the amazing tech team, and all who organised it. It was amazing to talk with panellists, with the individuals present, about how we can tackle the most pressing climate issues that we're all facing. And lastly, as we celebrate Black History Month this month, let's also take a moment to acknowledge the impact that the climate crisis has on all communities. So Black, African and Caribbean people are living within the UK or more likely to be living in the UK in poor quality homes that are more vulnerable to flooding, but also less equipped to deal with extreme heat. The climate crisis is a multifaceted issue. It's challenging. It's complicated to make progress. And it's even more complicated to make progress. We need to build a diverse group of individuals in order to make that progress. But progress is exactly what we will bring. And I look forward to being part of the team that brings it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I heard that Councillor Stanton would like to speak. Dominic?
Mr. Mayor, thank you. Yes. Firstly, may I congratulate the new Councillor Ume on an excellent maiden speech. I hear she's joining the licensing panel, so I look forward to working with her very soon. I'm very pleased to be speaking in support of this motion tonight. It's one that I think all of those present will welcome. Indeed, the timing of this motion now could not be more appropriate. Although originally scheduled to be heard earlier in the year at our July meeting, the sad passing of Colin Ahern has meant that we're now discussing this vital issue just a couple of weeks before the government's COP26 conference in Glasgow and the Council's own climate carnival at the end of this month. Now, as has already been said, it's obvious to anyone who watches the news that the effects of the change to our climate are becoming ever more apparent. From record ice melt in polar regions, last year being the second lowest on record for Arctic sea ice, to the devastating heat wave recently taking place in North America, and the unusually high temperatures in the late winter period across Europe and Asia in late February this year, change is happening, and it's happening now. Now, it is fair to say that this council has already recognised the need to effect change. And indeed, we declared a climate emergency in 2019 in a motion that was carried unanimously. But going forward, I think there are three main areas that we could look at locally where we may be able to do a little better. The first is recycling. We need to encourage more recycling. From the latest figures that I've found for 1920, in the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, the rate for household recycling was the 7th lowest in all of London. In fact, our rate was less than half that of Bexley, the #1 in London, and more disappointingly, nearly 20% down on our neighbouring Kensington and Chelsea. Now, for sure, local demographics will play some part in explaining this, but we clearly need to do better. The second point is traffic. Now, private car usage accounts for some 60% of transport emissions, whilst globally transport as a whole accounts for around a quarter of CO2 emissions. As the air pollution map of this borough makes painfully clear, our air pollution problem is in reality very much a traffic problem. Now, the traditional response to traffic pollution is to encourage, either with a carrot or a stick, more use of public transport and people-powered options such as walking or cycling. Like it or not, though, many people do rely on their cars and are not in a position to walk, cycle, or use public transport. Traditional systems such as the TfL congestion charge, for example, are a broad brush approach. They often come across as simply being anti-car, and they also disproportionately punish the less well-off, and are clearly not so far solving our city's transport problems. The upcoming extension of the ULEZ to H&F, for example, by targeting older, less efficient but less expensive vehicles, will hit hardest those who are least able to purchase newer, cleaner and more expensive vehicles. So H&F is very much a gateway for traffic coming into London, and so without a very large change in infrastructure and viable alternatives, what we're seeing now is unlikely to change in the foreseeable future. So what we should be doing now, I think, is looking for innovative solutions that actively help residents by reducing local congestion, improving local air quality, and discouraging the use of our borough as a thoroughfare. Proposals such as the South Fulham TCPR, which has already been mentioned tonight, aimed at reducing overall traffic in the area and improving congestion and journey times for local residents, is a very good example of this. More than anything, this council needs to consider the transport issues in the borough as a whole, rather than some sort of ineffective piecemeal strategy.
Councillor, you have one more minute.
Okay, thank you. So the third point I want to make is household emissions. Between 2001 and 2018, consumption-based greenhouse gas household emissions in LBHF reduced by a substantial amount. However, on a per capita basis, we still continue to emit the 10th highest rate in London. Technology moves swiftly, and the government's announcement yesterday of grants to aid the conversion to heat pumps rather than gas burning boilers is welcome. But in an area with a high level of multi-occupancy dwellings and where this technology will not be readily applicable to all, it will necessitate action from the council to ensure that the uptake we require will be possible. Now, clearly there are no easy solutions, and some might ask what difference a borough with less than 0.3% of the population of the UK, which is itself less than 1% of the global population, can make. But this is a global issue, and it will take a global response to make a difference. We need to be looking at innovative solutions to the problems we're facing.
Councillor, we're up to 5 minutes.
I have half a sentence left, if I may.
Please go further. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, we need to be looking at innovative solutions to the problems we're facing, harnessing technology and using our positions as leaders in the community to encourage residents and businesses to join the fight. And this must be done in a collaborative manner to ensure that we bring people with us, to incentivise rather than to compel, to encourage rather than criticise, and to persuade rather than coerce. Mr. Mayor, thank you again.
Thank you very much, Councillor. That was a very very long half sentence, but thank you very much indeed. I call on Jonathan Caleb-Landley to speak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to speak after I was fortunate enough and lucky enough to speak when we declared a climate emergency. And I have to say that I've been incredibly impressed by the speed in which the council has moved behind the emergency and the very real actions that are taking and in support of this emotion. I do have to admit that I've been slightly surprised by some of the inputs from the opposition today, as I feel that they've turned to the wrong party when it comes to the council, and their criticisms would be better directed at both the government and also members of their own party. Let me give you 3 reasons why. First, back in May 2021, the Conservative London Mayor candidate, Sean Bailey, campaigned against the very transport measures which were designed to reduce emissions. He said he would scrap within his first 100 days the new infrastructure designed to encourage walking and cycling. Secondly, when you look at the Conservative Party, many of the climate skeptics have rebranded their organisations to argue against the cost of the energy transition that we now find ourselves forward. Members like Steve Baker, Nigel Lawson have been very active long-term climate skeptics, and they have now rebranded the GWPF. I would suggest that it'd be good for our colleagues in the other party to show their commitment by arguing with their party and convincing them of the absolute urgency of action, particularly in this decade, and showing the real leadership that the Labour Party have shown when we went through a Climate Act, putting in binary legislation, which we have reported subsequently every 5 years, upping our ambition to do. Secondly, there's been mentions of things like homes, and talk about what the council could do more of. I think I would talk to Councillor Stanton and say, look, I completely agree. We need to be taking real action on homes. However, firstly, heat pumps are ineffective when they're not combined with retrofitting. However, the Conservative government have scrapped the retrofitting programme and currently have no plan or investment into retrofitting other than directing a small amount of money towards councils. Retrofitting is absolutely fundamental, particularly at the moment, in ensuring that our homes retain heat, but also to ensure that as we move to alternative forms of heating, they're actually efficient. It's a precursor to any heat pump. Secondly, there are innovative technologies that councils can pursue, and our council is certainly looking at them. You look at something like a heat network. That is technology that could be used today. However, The council need money to do this sort of programme, and we are going to have to wait till 2025 till the government provide a consultation backed up with potentially some funding on how they will empower a heat network programme across the country. More delay. I have to admit that I haven't read the plans that came out yesterday, but I have read most of their executive summaries, and they were incredibly light in detail, in particularly how we were going to fund an energy transition, which needs to be completed this decade. I would appreciate the opposition's.
You have 1 minute left, Councillor.
Thank you very much, Mayor. I appreciate the opposition's help in making it clear the government need to back their plans with investment and create greater detail and move at greater urgency. And then finally, the biggest thing that we could do is have a successful deal at COP26. However, there are three important ingredients to that. Firstly, global resilience funding. The government have cut their climate aid, have cut their aid just when it's needed most and just when UK leadership thought it was most important. Ending our reliance on fossil fuels. The government are funding oil, are looking to fund oil, and also have been kind of on the fence around some coal products. Again, a lack of leadership. So I would respectfully suggest to my colleagues and other benches that the real way they can show leadership is by supporting this motion and turning their criticism on their party and the government.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I see Councillor Andrew Brown, you have your hand up. Would you wish to speak?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, and apologies for having my camera off. I'm having some connectivity issues. Thank you for calling me to speak. It makes me chuckle somewhat, especially after listening to the previous speech. Criticism of probably the greenest, or most certainly the greenest government in our history, and the greenest Prime Minister in our history. A specific mention of coal, which was actually rejected by the Conservative government. He referenced one rather insignificant backbench MP who perhaps might be a climate skeptic, and also a chancellor from the 1980s. So not particularly current when it comes to leading Conservative Party policy on this issue. But on the specific mention of coal, I believe that Councillor Caleb Landy and all the Labour councillors in Hammersmith and Fulham campaigned for MPs at the last two general elections on a specific policy of reopening the pits and restarting the coal industry in this country. So the gross hypocrisy, is startling, but perhaps not unsurprising. But I think what strikes me most is there's always this tactic or philosophy or instinct from the Labour group in Hammersmith and Fulham to point the finger at the government, despite the government leading the charge at COP26 with their attempts to create a deal to improve the global response to the climate emergency. But they have very little to say when it comes to what they're doing in their own borough, where they are the administration. And whilst we accept that there have been some innovations and some projects that they have brought in, I think lots of what they have done is conversation. It's all talk, little action. How many council buildings that the council own have been fitted with solar panels, either to generate electricity or to generate heat to heat those buildings? What proportion of the council's housing stock, of which is a very significant proportion of the housing in this borough, have been retrofitted with insulation? What proportion have been given solar panels or other forms of renewable energy generation? What have the council been doing with its fleet of vehicles? What proportion of those have been converted to run on electricity? These are all important actions that could be taken this day, that could have been taken 2 years ago when we first declared the climate emergency. And it's all well and good focusing on the very important and very significant to local people issues around air pollution and traffic. But that is only, as Councillor Stanton laid out, a relatively small proportion of the much wider picture of the climate emergency. You know, for our local residents, yes, it's important to improve traffic and to reduce air pollution. That is critical. But to play our part in the wider climate emergency, which we're referring to, not air pollution, which is a more local issue, then much more significant steps need to be taken in order to make significant changes to the amount of CO2 that our homes and our businesses generate. You know, what has been done with the planning policy in order to make sure that new builds and renovations to homes and business properties require some installation of CO2 saving measures. You know, these are all things that can be done today, and we need a little bit more action and a little bit less conversation from this administration. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other speakers? Councillor Cowan?
Yeah, it's sometimes people say to me, you know, what actually happens at the full council meetings, and when I describe some of the worst things that happen, that people are a little surprised and wonder what we're all doing. You know, if these meetings are to mean anything, they have to address the issues the residents care about, and many residents are waking up to the fact, and many residents did a long time ago, that we face an emergency. Now, I appreciate the time and place for political knockabout, but I do wonder whether we've moved on a little bit and should be having a much more serious debate. Because the last speech, and indeed the speech the same individual gave earlier, just didn't cut the mark. Not because some of the points weren't legitimate, but because quite evidently many of the points were generic. And I suspect if there was more diligence put into looking what actually the council is doing and what its plan is to do more, we'd have a much more reasoned debate. So let's just shoot some of the foxes before we work out where we're going. We have more electric car charging bays than anywhere else in Britain. We were the first council to move to put electric car charging bays in. When others had 3, we were aiming to put 400 in, and we moved very quickly on that. 2 years ago, at a budget meeting, the leader of the opposition at the time said we should try experimenting and putting electric car charging points into lamppost. We'd had them for 18 months and we were putting them in at record pace as we continue to do. Now that is just one instance where if it's have a reasoned debate, it does rely on the people on the other side being informed about what we've done, what we're struggling with, and what we're intending to do next. Ian Cassidy deserves huge praise as possibly the most successful council to divest its pension fund, its vast amounts of billions of pounds, from fossil fuels, which is what we've done successfully, almost as good as the Environment Agency, but I think I'm right in saying better than any other council and the second most successful governmental body. We are spending 100 million on climate improvements to council estates. We would spend the same on private houses if we could, although we think that's the government's responsibility to incentivise residents. And whilst we will do our bit in this time of austerity, and we are doing a considerable bit, really, what we would do with a lot of effort, the government could do at the swipe of a pen if it properly funded a move to green energy, as had happened under the Labour government, and which David Cameron's government and Nick Clegg's government cancelled. All our council buildings are now 100% renewable energy. The new civic campus building, and given its grade 2 listed building, will be the greenest historic building anywhere in Britain, with a pioneering ground heat pump that takes energy from the ground. We're replacing the fleet of refuse collections with electric vehicles and have contracts going out. Leaving the European Union didn't help that, because many of those are made in the European Union, and we've already seen that we can't get things on the shelves. That applies, so we can't get big things like electric vehicles, but we're working on it. It's a priority. There is a budget, and if the speakers who are criticising it has attended the PACs and taken part in the debates, they wouldn't be making such generic and bland criticisms, leaving me to wonder if, rather than having a sincere debate, all we're doing here is a political knockabout 6 months before an election. Well, I can tell you, whilst the election is very important, this emergency is an emergency. And that's why we're moving at pace to deal with the climate change issue. Our new brand, Climate Action Together, indicates that we're not just wanting the council to be climate neutral by 2030, we want the borough to be so too. And that does mean we need to stress the together. We need to build our partnerships with businesses. We need to encourage a movement of residents who are as committed to this as everybody else genuinely is. And that's why I'm very pleased we set up a first climate commission to give us ideas on what else we might do and to act as a critical friend. And a second climate commission led by a resident, also a former expert civil servant, who has managed to bring in another environmental expert to work with us to deliver at pace the climate change. And those climate commissions, which I chair on a 2-weekly basis, well, I did chair, I've now handed over to the climate commissioner because I think it's important we do that, but I attend and take an active part in, are served by the first of its kind climate unit, looking to cut across all different council departments to make sure that climate emergency action is something that every department delivers on. And if that sounds like just a promise, look at the strategy, look what's already being delivered on. So I would just call on the opposition not to play politics with this matter, maybe
Councillor.
to talk, to do 3 things. Talk to Greg Hans and stop him opposing traffic changes in South Fulham, which has made South Fulham the cleanest in the borough, some of the
Councillor.
cleanest in London, and join with us in getting on top of the detail and working with us, rather than making these cheap pot shops. It's just, you're better than that, I hope.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Are there any other speeches? No, there's no other speeches. We'll put the amendment to the vote. Councillor Kwan, how does the Labour Group wish to vote on this amendment?
We'll be voting for the amendment.
For the amendment. Councillor Carmel, how does the Conservative Group wish to vote on the amendment?
We will be voting for the amendment.
You'll be voting for the amendment. Does any member wish to vote differently? I declare the amendment unanimously carried. Are there any other speakers on the motion as amended? I now call on Councillor Brown, Councillor Andrew Brown, to sum up.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As we came together to vote on and support the original climate emergency, we felt it appropriate to also support your amendments and the motion as amended. You know, I always enjoy the Leader of the Council's interventions, but I always find it's humorous that he criticises the opposition for trying to hold the administration to account, but doesn't criticise his own councillors for making cheap pot shots about the government, who I think have been clearly demonstrating a significant amount of global leadership on this issue. But I'm glad to see that you know, the council is taking this issue seriously. However, as I've said in my previous speeches, we need a much greater pace of action, less conversation, less commissions, less you know, papers on this, and more actual action on what can be done and can be done today and can be done yesterday. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much. I declare the amended motion carried. Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I now put the amended motion to the vote. Councillor Kwan, how does the Labour Group wish to vote?
The Labour Group votes for the amended motion.
Councillor Carmel, how does the Conservative Group wish to vote?
We vote for the motion as amended.
Thank you very much indeed. Do any members wish to vote differently? I declare the amended motion carried. Councillor Kwan.
Mr. Mayor, under Standing Order 15E3, can I now ask that the special motions listed in the agenda now be rearranged in the following order? Number 5, 4, 2, 7, 6, and 3.
Thank you. Is that seconded?
Seconded, formally seconded.
Thank you very much. Is that agreed? Okay. I take it as agreed. I now move to special motion number 5, the threat to Charing Cross Hospital proposed by the Health and Social Care Bill. I call on Councillor Ben Coleman and Lucy Richardson to move and second.
Formally moved.
I call on Councillor Coleman, followed by Councillor Richardson, to speak for the administration.
Well, Mr. Mayor, when Matt Hancock resigned as Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, I can't be the only one of us who felt that this was long overdue. I felt he should have resigned not for perhaps he should have resigned for what he resigned over, but he should have resigned long before that, when he wasted £37 billion on a failed national test and trace system, which had to be rescued by councils who should have been involved from the beginning. He should have resigned, I think, sooner, when he claimed that the government had placed a protective ring around care homes at the start of the crisis, when, as is now public knowledge, they'd actually told hospitals to discharge residents back into care homes without testing, which cost lives. And as you know, we were the only council in the country to refuse to accept that, and the hospitals here had to change what they did. And then, of course, there's the Health and Social Care Bill, which isn't as widely discussed so far, but I think will become a matter of great concern for many people. Matt Hancock's baby, Health and Social Care Bill, his legacy, and what I'd like to focus on today, because this is a bill which increases the power of the Secretary of State at the expense of our local people, of local accountability and local democracy. Now, the bill says it aims to increase local decision-making in healthcare services, and that's great. I'm sure we do all support that idea. But it's when you look at the detail of the bill that questions start to arise, and you start to see unsettling things. You start to see new powers for the Secretary of State to install compliant allies to run the new integrated care systems, or you start to see new powers for the Secretary of State to direct councils' social care services. And most seriously, I think for us here today, you see a new power for the Secretary of State to intervene in local service configuration proposals. That's the jargon. Remove them from local scrutiny and take the final decision, him or herself. It's all there for those of you who want to check, by the way, and I know there are some who'll be rushing to the internet at Schedule 6, Section 38 of the bill, available online. The Local Government Association has already expressed very grave concerns about what's planned. They say, we're concerned this may undermine the existing powers and duties of local authority, health and overview and scrutiny committees. The King's Fund, well-regarded health think tank, says this is at odds with the stated intention of the reforms to empower local decision-making. Now, Mr. Mayor, I'm aware this may seem a little bit dry talking about the words in the bill, but let me tell you why it's a particular concern and should be a particular concern to us here in Hammersmith and Fulham. Because just supposing Imperial College Healthcare NHS Trust ever wanted to try again to close Charing Cross Hospital's accident and emergency and sell off most of its land, as was previously the case before we won the battle alongside residents to save Charing Cross Hospital, what would happen then under this bill? Would the council again be able to challenge the hospital relentlessly at scrutiny committees to probe and to expose its flawed thinking? Would residents be able to challenge NHS bosses with reasoned and powerful arguments at meetings in public, the way that the amazing Save Our Hospitals so brilliantly did? Would, if this bill goes through as it is, so much of what we and residents did working together side by side to save Charing Cross Hospital still be possible? No. If this bill goes through unchanged, it wouldn't. Because the Secretary of State can just call it in, take the decision himself, cut out the local democracy. And Mr. Mayor, this is deeply worrying for the residents of Hammersmith and Fulham. Perhaps less worrying for those Conservative councillors who undermined the campaign to save Charing Cross Hospital by consistently claiming that there was no threat when the NHS had explicitly set out in black and white. But for those of the rest of us, for the rest of us here, it is a major problem, this bill. Those of us who campaigned so long to fight and win the campaign, it's a major problem, a major potential threat. Now, I had hoped, Mr. Mayor, that the new Secretary of State for Health, Sajid Javid, would take a new approach.
Councillor, it's one way.
Thank you. One which respected local democracy and removed the parts of the bill which could threaten Charing Cross Hospital. Sadly, so far, no such luck. The only change I can see is a hurriedly inserted sentence into the non-binding explanatory notes to the bill, which say the new powers don't remove the local health oversight and scrutiny committee role. Fine. There's nothing, however, in the bill itself that provides this reassurance, and that's the law, not some note the government puts out in panic. Mr. Mayor, it's not too late. This bill is still going through Parliament. the Secretary of State could still make the changes that would remove the potential threat to Charing Cross Hospital. And I can only say, if he won't, we in this borough, given our experience, have to wonder why. So I hope that all members here tonight will join me in urging the Secretary of State to save the possibility of us having to fight yet another campaign to save Charing Cross Hospital, and vote together with the administration for this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Richardson.
Thank you. The pandemic. Could anything at all good have come out of such a horrendous time? A glimmer. Locally, strong partnership working evolved. The NHS and Imperial Adult Social Care Team, our Public Health, H&F CAN, and members such as Councillor Coleman and Councillor Cowan just put their heads down in the national chaos and got on with it. Going against central government guidance, our social care team made the decision to close care homes early, protecting vulnerable local residents. And that makes me very proud. This bill seems to be agreeing to modernise and decentralise. So does it promote these valuable, positive local networks? No, the bill does not. It does the opposite. It overrides it by giving absolute powers to the Secretary of State to overrule doctors' expert clinical judgment, eroding the very local powers it says it's promoting. Now let's look at money. In the aftermath of the pandemic, the country faces a major backlog of unmet health needs, chronic shortfalls in the NHS and social care workforce, glaring health irregularities, and a social care system on its knees. So does this bill provide sufficient funding for the NHS social care to improve quality and speed of treatment and care? Does it fund the substantial refurbishment of Charing Cross, which is urgently needed and which, bizarrely, we are having to wait 5 years for? No, it does not. The bill does nothing to address these fundamental changes. It gives no investment from the government. So what does the bill do? It removes the requirement to tender services, paving the way for much more cronyism, sweetheart deals between ministers and favoured contractors. Cronyism. Should we just reflect for a moment on what cronyism looks like, what it feels like to ordinary people on the ground who don't have private healthcare, who rely on the NHS? Early on in the COVID crisis, hospital workers worked without PPE, whilst contracts worth 280 million were simply handed to fast-tracked through government high-priority fast lane to two companies with no experience of PPE, one of whom, Lux Lifestyle, was a tiny company which didn't even have any staff and was already 9K in debt. In the Health and Social Care Committee report, at the height of the pandemic, nurses reported receiving unusable PPE from central government, masks on which the elastic was rotten, goggles which were unsafe, and opening a box of gowns to find insects inside. The very workers who nursed our Prime Minister back to health. In the High Court recently, a judgment was made that the Secretary of State broke the law, failing to publish details of billions of pounds spent on procurement of PPE during the pandemic. This bill is a flimsy piece of rhetoric, paying lip service to integrated care and throwing a bone to some of those within the NHS, while actually failing to give any of the funding that it desperately needs. By decreasing the voice of people and the clinicians in the NHS, it's paving the way for privatisation. We've seen the multinational businesses like GP at Hand and Centene colonising local practice. With this bill, this is likely to spread through the NHS, with shareholders, not patients or clinicians, calling the shot. The very idea of giving the Secretary of State powers over the NHS is, as Jennifer Dixon, Chief Exec of the Health Foundation, says, politically driven with no clear rationale and risks taking healthcare backwards. The bill is putting the nation's health into the hands of a political populist who will promise one thing to get votes, the millions of pounds for the NHS, and once in power will forget all about it.
So, Councillor, one more minute.
Do we really want to see our National Health Service driven away and forgotten about, just like the promise of the 350 million for the NHS on that bus? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I have Andrew Brown and Councillor Amanda Lloyd-Harris who wish to speak, and I'll call Councillor Andrew Brown first. Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to quote the leader of the council who referenced the upcoming election in less than a year's time. So it's little surprise that there's a motion such as this from the Labour group, and you never waste any opportunity to try and scare residents about the future of Charing Cross Hospital. However, as I've said previously on numerous occasions, I have recognised and the group has recognised the very important role that this administration and this council played in fighting to stop the proposals and shaping a healthier future, and even more so the resident-led campaign led by Save Our Hospitals. However, what the administration on every occasion fails to recognise is the crucial role played by the Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, as he formerly was, in making that final decision, or more accurately, putting pressure on the NHS to make that final decision with regard to shaping a healthier future. And the lobbying, also forgetting the lobbying that Greg Hands MP and myself carried out over multiple years, 3, 4, 5 years, initially with Jeremy Hunt MP when he was Secretary of State, and then finally and successfully with Matt Hancock to get the threat to our hospital removed. And I think what several of the previous speakers have failed to recognise is that it was actually the Health and Social Care Act that passed those powers to primarily senior executives in the local NHS that was a significant contributor to the threat to our hospital. It was the former Labour Health Minister, Lord Aradazi, who is a very respected and senior surgeon who's based at St Mary's Hospital, who was one of the architects of the plan to centralise services in Paddington at St Mary's. There's very little acknowledgement of that, or even recognition of that from the administration and its speakers. What this bill does, and it's the Health and Care Bill, not the Health and Social Care Bill, is that it does give the Secretary of State that ultimate power, which the Secretary of State should have, to make the final decisions on these important healthcare, these important NHS issues, which is ultimately what the elected government of the day is there to do. Now, I'm sorry if the Labour Party feel that Charing Cross being saved is no longer a arrow in their electoral armament, but that's just the fact. And the fact that this government is investing millions and millions of pounds in a floor-by-floor refurbishment of Charing Cross should put to bed any disbelief that they have that Charing Cross's future is secure. But what we will do, and what we'll always do, is if any future threat presents itself, and since COVID, I think it's clear to everyone the essential role that Charing Cross has, if it wasn't already patently clear before, to all within the NHS, that our hospital must be secure and it must be invested in to make sure it's fit and proper for the 21st century. But I'm going to conclude by quoting Brendan Cox, who is this week, following the tragic death of Sir David Amess, criticised those in political life for dehumanising behaviour. And I will never forget for dehumanising behaviour carried out by members of the Labour group putting pictures of Grim Reapers with a blue rosette on their election material. And that is what this is about. So I'm sorry if the cabinet
Councillor, you have
member
30 seconds.
doesn't like the health and care bill. It is currently going through its committee stages and it's yet to be amended. So I'm sure some of his concerns and some of the very valid concerns raised by the LGN and others will be taken into account. But let's not use this as cheap, dehumanising methods of trying to win elections. Thank you, Mr.
Councillor.
Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Sorry, Councillor Lloyd-Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This motion is littered with negative and scaremongering points. It's probably an opportune time to remind the administration that the Conservative government was duly elected in 2019 by what can only be described as a landslide victory, so it has a mandate to govern. I see no threat to democracy by any elected government presenting white papers and governing. That's what governments and councils do. This is what they're elected to do. Labor reminds us that the general elections, the council elections, I should say, are approaching by raising yet again the issue of the closure of Charing Cross Hospital. When I first moved to Fulham in 1994, it was mentioned then, and in every subsequent election, it has appeared. Since I was in Charing Cross Hospital about 6 weeks ago, I can attest that it is still very much running and operating effectively. It is disappointing that given the size and complexity of the Health and Social Care Bill, that they could not find anything positive to say. The motion is full of inaccuracies, which is not helpful to informed debate. The government has repeatedly used slogans during COVID saying, stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. Is that the mantra of a government that is likely to dismantle the NHS? No, of course it's not. Why does the administration keep on repeating this old chestnut that the government wants to close Charing Cross Hospital? The government wants to keep it open, but if the administration knows differently, then please share publicly your evidence. The government is committed to the reforms of public health to make it more effective and improve health outcomes and reduce inequalities. Hence the Office of Health Improvements and Disparities run by Professor Chris Whitty. The government has publicly stated the importance of national, regional and locals working hand in glove with local authorities. It's time to work together and stop the scaremongering. It's unhelpful and it frightens the public who depend on the NHS, Charing Cross Hospital and their staff being there in their time of need. So I actually would consider you actually not supporting this motion because I don't think it's in the best interests of the public. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any other councillors who wish to speak? Councillor Cowan.
I'll just say a couple of words, which is the motion is about changes to the law that would allow the Secretary of State to close hospitals without any reference to a local authority, which currently has responsibility for public health and can call in matters via its scrutiny process. And if anyone says that's not important, they don't know how Charing Cross Hospital was saved, because it was that aspect of the law that allowed us to set up the independent Michael Mansfield Commission with 4 other councils, and therefore to basically say to the government and the health officials behind the plan to close Charing Cross Hospital, it is evidently unsafe for you to close it, as I think we've seen in the COVID crisis. If you want to close it, give us a business plan that proves it's safe. And because they could never prove it was safe, they delayed and delayed and delayed from 2019, which is when it was meant to be closed, to 2021, where they actually offered me, would you like us to delay it till after the election so you can have a win? And I said, no, we're sincerely interested in saving the hospital. And then they wanted to delay it to 2025. And when they started talking about delaying it to 2030, it was evident they couldn't pass a bill through that had been signed off, the Safer, Healthier Future Plan, which had been signed off by the Secretary of State in 2013. That's why Charing Cross was saved, because the scrutiny process was fundamental to it. And that's what this debate is about tonight. So support it, don't support it. It's up to the opposition. But don't claim that the opposition played a role in saving the hospital. It is a matter of public record of all the things that were said and done, either recordings and indeed tweets from the former leader of opposition, from Greg Hand's MP, and from many people in the Conservative administration, although not the last speaker at the time. So having them try to claim credit, muscle in, is a bit like the German generals at Versailles taking credit for the Allies winning World War I. Yes, they surrendered, but after no mean battle were they lost. And that's precisely what happened to the Conservatives here. That's not the point of this motion, though. The point of this motion is very clearly to stop.
Mr. Mayor, can I raise a point of personal explanation, please?
Sorry, can I just interrupt the two of you? For a point of personal explanation, it has to be about something that you have actively said that's been misinterpreted or misspoken. So if you're going to raise that point, please be very specific on what has been said, where you've been misquoted, and please don't go into an explanation, just give us the factual detail. Thank you.
Well, as I've been named and slandered by the leader of the council.
Sorry, Councillor, just the fact that you are named does not give you the right to speak. It's if you have been misinterpreted.
I have been misinterpreted. I have been misquoted.
Sorry, Councillor, I'm speaking. So please be very factual in your response as to when you've been misinterpreted and to make it, or misquoted, and to make that very, very brief. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and apologies for speaking over. It wasn't my intention. I was deliberately, misquoted. I've been a vociferous supporter of trying to save Charing Cross Hospital since I've been elected. The leader of the council and I may have.
I'm sorry, Councillor.
I'm waiting
to hear how you have been misquoted. I've yet to hear how you have been misquoted. Please.
The leader of the council specifically stated that I, on record, was against saving the hospital. That is factually incorrect. He also stated that we had nothing to do with the saving of Charing Cross Hospital. That is something that has been publicly refuted by the former Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, who was the one who made the NHS take the decision to save the hospital. So and then the fact of comparing us to German generals is the kind of dehumanizing behavior that I was referring to in my speech.
With the rules behind this. The rules behind this are when you have been misquoted or when you have been deliberately misinterpreted. It's not other things for you to come back on in the speech. Those are the rules of the Constitution that we as a council have all agreed. I'm now going to move on. Thank you very much, Councillor.
Thank you.
Councillor Cowan, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, no, just as a matter, what I will do is publish all the things. I think we published it a few years ago where we brought a motion to the council listing all the former leader of the opposition's comments on this. And it was absolutely clear, while we were saying to the public the hospital was under threat, the Conservative group, led by active Conservatives such as the person who just intervened, were saying it wasn't under threat, that it was lies, that it was falsehoods, that it was scaremongering. None of that was true. The hospital was about to be demolished. It would be replaced by something they cleverly thought up as a local hospital, which was in fact a clinic without beds, 13% the size of a hospital. Now, as I said, we stopped that in this administration with no support from the Conservative opposition, and in fact, with the Conservative opposition actively attacking us for trying to do it all the way through. It's a matter of record. There are recordings, there are tweets, and I will certainly publish them to remind people what we were up against in that fight. But certainly the last speaker who just intervened was one of those individuals who we were fighting against. I think that's widely recognized in the public. And if he doesn't recognize it, I will help him by circulating that record. That's not what this is about. This is about how we save the hospital. Now, I've detailed that if the government is allowed to make
Mr.
the
Mayor, can I
changes-
raise another
if
point
the
of
government
personal
is allowed to
explanation,
make the
please?
changes,
No, we'll come to that later. Thank you.
if the government
Thank you,
is allowed
councillor.
to,
I'm not taking that. Sorry, councillor.
if the government is allowed to make the changes that it's planning to make, if the government is allowed to make the changes it's planning to make, then they will be able to close hospitals without any reference to
Sorry,
any
councillor,
local.
can I just stop you? I've been advised. Sorry, councillor Brown, you are allowed to come in. Sorry, councillor Brown, you're on mute.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I did think that was my right under the Constitution, and I appreciate you for making that ruling. Can I again reiterate that the Leader of the Council has defamed me? He has specifically quoted and referenced a set of tweets that were taken out of context and represent a tiny minority of the comments that I have made and the speeches that I've made, the tweets that I've made on saving Charing Cross Hospital. You know, if he wishes to play these games, then there are ways to do that. However, to repeat those lies is thoroughly inappropriate.
Councillor, the idea of this particular intervention is to allow people to point out when something has been done that is wrong, not then go on to make a subsequent speech.
Which is what I did. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Or to make subsequent comments. So if you just speak to the facts, that's all that's required. Thank you very much. Sorry, Councillor Cowan.
Just to be clear, I've defamed nobody, and as I already said, I will circulate the tweets which I in full, which were sent out by the former leader of the opposition. I think there's very little interpretation when people are being told they're scaremongering, they're falsehoods or lies. And indeed, I've just seen a tweet from Greg Hands, which did indeed claim that any closure of Charing Cross was a falsehood, and that is a matter of public record. And I think we need to recognise this as a debate, not a barroom argument. And I would encourage you not to keep taking the ridiculous interventions that we've had. This motion is very simply giving the opposition a chance to prove how much it cares for localism, how it recognised how Charing Cross Hospital was saved, and that is in protecting the mechanisms that we used precisely to save it. And you're either for it, what we're trying to do, or you're against it. But given your record of attacking us throughout, of as a Conservative administration as well, dishonestly telling the public the hospital had already been saved when it hadn't, we are offering you a chance to make some amends. Vote for this motion. Vote to keep the mechanism, the legal mechanism we use to save Charing Cross, and then that will be the end of it. It's not an election stunt. It's a stunt to protect this hospital. It's a mechanism to protect this hospital going forward from on in. And we're offering you the chance to support us. And I hope you do that.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Are there any other speakers? No other speakers. I'll then call on Councillor Coleman to sum up.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I would like to go back to the bill in a minute and just read you a few extracts from it, just to reinforce the point that I've been making and the other speakers, my colleagues, have been making. But I do think it's helpful. It's so bizarre. The way I've grown up to have debates is you make a point, someone else makes a point, but if you're mentioned, you don't get the chance to stand up and scream that you're misquoted. But I've gone back and I forgive me, but I've taken the opportunity of looking at some of these tweets that were so-called out of context. Andrew Brown tweeting 27th of November 2017, the STP plan, that's the plan for Charing Cross Hospital, states that Charing Cross Hospital will continue to provide its current A&E and wider services for at least the lifetime of the plan. Now, we knew at that stage what they were planning to do because of the letters and the exposés that we've been involved in. Then 2014, he'd been saying the same thing for 3 years, back in 2014, 15th of May. Charing Cross will retain an A&E and many other services, will specialise in oncology, geriatrics and world-class elective surgery. The persistent line from the Conservative leader of the Conservative councillors at the time, which he no longer is, and I can understand perhaps why that is the case, the consistent line from the Member of Parliament, Greg Hands, was that Charing Cross Hospital was not under threat and we were scaremongering. The bizarre thing is when, just a few months before the general election in 2019, the fantastic campaign that residents mounted alongside the council to save Charing Cross led them panicking to cancel the plans to close Charing Cross Hospital. They then said, we've saved the hospital, not adding, we've saved the hospital that we claimed was never threatened in the first place. absolute nonsense. So let me be very clear. It is the job of this administration that the residents have given us of this borough to spot the threats to Charing Cross Hospital and to fight to neutralise them. And that is what we are doing here today, and that is what we will always do. So when it says at Schedule 613, Section 38 of the bill, that the Secretary of State may call in any proposal by an NHS commissioning body for the reconfiguration of NHS services, he may then take any, or she, if it's she in the future, may take any decision in relation to the proposal. What that means is simply to me, and I think to my colleagues, that if we have in the future some NHS bosses who might want to close Charing Cross Hospital as quickly as possible and without the scrutiny that we subjected them to in the past, they could have a quiet word with the Secretary of State. He could then, or she could then, call in the proposal and take the decision himself or herself swiftly without the local people having almost before they knew what had happened. We think this is wrong. We think this part of the bill, which has good things in it, threatens Charing Cross Hospital potentially for the future. We hope that the new Secretary of State will remove it from the bill, and we would urge everybody, no matter what they may be considering when they came in the room, everybody in this room and everybody on both sides of this chamber to vote for it and see off this potential threat to the hospital that we on this side of the chamber have fought so hard alongside residents to save. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor. And we now move to the vote. Councillor Corn, how does the Labour Group wish to vote on the motion?
The Labour Group votes for the motion.
Thank you. Councillor Carmel, how does the Conservative Group wish to vote on the motion?
We are not supporting the motion.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Does any member wish to vote differently? I declare the motion carried. We now move on to special motion number 4, 7.4.
Forgive me, Mr. Mayor, I couldn't hear because of Councillor Carmel's mask. When he said he wasn't supporting the motion, does he mean he was voting against it or abstaining?
He was voting against it.
Thank you.
Is that right, Councillor Carmel? Thank you. We now move on to item 7.4, the decision of the Secretary of State for Housing and Local Governments and Communities to call in the planning application for the Edith Summerskill House on the Clement Attlee estate in Fulham. I call on Councillor Andrew Jones and Councillor Lisa Holman to move and second.
Formally moved.
Formally second.
Thank you. I call on Councillor Jones, followed by Councillor Holman, to speak for the administration. Councillor Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, in light of the discussion we've just had, I recognise that this motion criticises the government, but it criticises the government on something very specific. And I would hope there is a degree of understanding of what my good friend, no longer with us, Colin Ahern, described as a bad decision. And indeed, this motion is another one that would have come in the summer, of course. And it was the subject of one of the final conversations I had with him, where Colin said, this is the motion about a bad decision. You will note it's very factual, okay? In terms of the discussion we've had, it makes a list of points about what has happened in relation to Edith Summerskill House. And in summary, to set the context, we were building a replacement block on Edith Summerskill House, which I know is familiar to many members of the opposition, including the current leader who represented that ward, which at the 11th hour received a call in from the then Secretary of State around its planning consent. This was a very delayed decision. We waited 9 months for the Secretary of State to undertake this action, which has had very significant consequences on a number of fronts. The first and most obviously is a delay in a very significant project to provide genuinely affordable housing, which is a core commitment of this administration on the site of affordable housing. Essentially we were replacing and slightly increasing the number of genuinely affordable houses that were on the Clement Attlee estate. The second, of course, is a significant detrimental impact on the lives of many residents who are on amongst the thousands of people on our housing waiting list. We have one of the highest levels of overcrowded housing in the country, and this project is a significant contribution to addressing that list. And the third is around our current needs for temporary housing accommodation, much of which is a statutory responsibility, where we are incurring significantly increased costs imposed on the council by this delay, as the motion sets out, by having to provide accommodation for people who wouldn't otherwise. So the motion sets out a number of things. We were 105 temporary households that are going to cost the authority 175,000 a month. The council has spent £4.5 million in this process. It undertook extensive consultation. The planning committee here granted consent. The Mayor of London and the GLA have granted consent, and then we waited 9 months for the Secretary of State at the 11th hour to call in, notionally on the grounds of a technical point about it being a tall building. The building, of course, is almost identical in height and design to the building that was previously there and stood empty for 10 years. The Labour administration was in the same joint venture partnership with the developer and had worked with them, admittedly increasing the proportion of genuinely affordable housing in the block, but to all intents and purposes, this is the same development that the previous Conservative administration had brought forward with some less of genuinely affordable, but affordable housing in it. So under the previous Conservative administration, this was an acceptable development and was being brought forward. But under the current proposals from the Labour administration, a very, very similar development notion on the grounds of a tall building is the objection was called in. For those familiar, and people are, this is not the only tall building on the Clement Attlee estate. It is 35 yards away from an identical block that was built in the 1960s. And of course, there are other tall buildings in the area, but within our planning policy, there are grounds for call-in. So the consequence is quite significant, both for the residents of this borough who need genuinely affordable housing, for the costs imposed on the council.
You have 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. The costs around temporary housing and what will amount to a 4-year delay in the project, assuming that the Secretary of State, that the public inquiry, which commences later next month, eventually allows the project to proceed. So I would call on all members in this chamber to support this motion. This, as Councillor Hearn said to me in one of his final conversations with me, is a bad decision. Bad decisions happen in politics. It is not an appropriate decision. The council, Peabody Housing, have invested a lot of time and money in developing this. There's been extensive consultation. At the very final moment, it was called in and is creating a significant cost, a significant impact on the lives of residents who are in overcrowded housing and accommodation. I recognise that some people object to tall buildings, but the level of objection thus far is similar to that in the planning process, which was not that great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor. Councillor Homan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The motion as written on the order paper pretty much sets out the reason why, the details of why we should be supporting it. And Councillor Jones has very ably talked a lot more about that, and I'll touch on some of those points. But what seems to be very clear, I think, is this is just typical of the Conservative Party's attitude towards genuinely affordable housing. And regrettably, this is to the detriment of many Hammersmith and Fulham residents who are in housing need. Edith Summer School House has become quite a saga. Under the previous Tory administration, decanting actually began in 2011. And as I understand it, originally this was to carry out decent homes works. But in December 2011, the decision was taken to redevelop the site. That is now over 10 years ago. It was not until 2014, February 2014, almost 2.5 years after that, and just before the local elections when Labour won the council, that the cabinet decision was taken to set up the joint venture to redevelop the site. The original plan set out the delivery of 133 new homes, 60% of them market sale and 40% of them at discount market sale, a virtually 100% private housing development with no social rented homes to address local housing need or to replace the 68 council homes that were previously there. Not only was this genuinely a bad deal for affordable housing, but also very poorly put together in terms of the agreement. Since being elected in 2014, the Labour administration has been working on getting a better deal for residents from the plan that was previously offered. This meant refining the joint venture agreement, renegotiating the procurement and legal aspects, and getting a better finance deal in place to significantly increase the number of affordable homes. By 2016, that new JV had been renegotiated, and as you've already heard from Councillor Jones, that will now bring 133 new homes, 80% for social rent, and that's a massive increase on the previous scheme, even though the designs are almost the same. Planning permission was granted. It was called in by a resident, but the High Court quashed the appeal. And then we go to Planning Committee again. It was agreed on the 28th of September 2020 and called in or request to call into the Secretary of State by one Greg Hams MP the day afterwards, the 29th of September. And as has already been pointed out, it wasn't until June this year that we actually got confirmed that it would be called in. The power to call in a planning application is very general, and the Secretary of State can call in just about anything. But in practice, very few applications are called in. They normally relate to planning application issues of national significance, major infrastructure projects, or issues of historical merit, such as the Holocaust Memorial in Victoria Gardens, Westminster, or the West Cumbria coal mine. A scheme like Edith Summerskill House would not normally be something called in, and it seems that this is simply because Greg Hams, the Tory MP for Chelsea and Fulham, asked the Secretary of State to do it. Hammersmith and Fulham needs more genuinely affordable homes. Further delays will impact on those overcrowded family.
Councillor Holman, you have 1 more minute.
Thank you. And on those in temporary accommodation. 17% of households in Hammersmith and Fulham are overcrowded. House prices in private rented sectors are well above the London average, and Hammersmith and Fulham has the 4th highest house prices in the country. Those families in housing need can't afford to wait. This council cannot afford to wait. We need to build more genuinely affordable homes in challenging circumstances and doing everything possible to deliver. Unnecessary delays do everyone a disservice. That is why we've brought the motion tonight. Please support.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I have 4 councillors who have indicated to me they wish to speak, which is Councillor Holder, Thorley, Rowbottom and Carmel, and I'll call them in that order. If anybody else would like to speak, please let me know. Councillor Holder.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The decision of the Secretary of State for Housing and Local Communities to call in the planning application for Edith Summerskill House on the Clem Attlee estate in Fulham is simply wrong. It's wrong because the Secretary of State's own former Conservative colleagues in Hammersmith and Fulham originally imposed the unnecessary closure of Edith Summerskill House, abandoning the building and abandoning residents who only believed that they were moving out temporarily, leaving behind the derelict Edith Summerskill House to be finally demolished by this Labour administration. It's wrong because the Secretary of State's own former Conservative colleagues in Hammersmith and Fulham left Edith Summerskill House uninhabitable. Fulham desperately needs housing, resulting in this Labour administration's decision to plan and invest in the rebuilding of Edith Summerskill House and the necessary high quality social rent homes it deserves. It's wrong because only when the Secretary of State's own Conservative colleagues in Hammersmith and Fulham witness this Labour administration creating something positive for residents in Fulham, who, by the way, still urgently need genuinely affordable homes, does this Conservative government decide to delay progress and impose as much as £1.26 million to the overall cost of the project? The Secretary of State's delay is likely to cost Fulham residents not only 133 desperately needed new affordable homes, but also planned additional community facilities and play space for children, job opportunities for local apprenticeships, and contracts won to supply building materials for local businesses. Like my fellow colleagues have highlighted, the decision to call in the planning application for Edith Summerskill House is both dubious and unnecessary, a view shared by my Clematley residents, further demonstrating that they agree this decision is wrong. Edith Summerskill House was originally identified under the previous Conservative administration as an affordable private tenure redevelopment, and the current Labour administration scheme planned is comparable to that, which has been proposed for nearly a decade. So why has the Secretary of State chosen to call in Edith Summerskill House now, but not previously? This council calls upon the government to cancel this unjustified, costly and detrimental 11th hour decision and to follow or allow the scheme to proceed in order to deliver the much needed, genuinely affordable housing needed in Fulham. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Thorley.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As we all know, Edith Summerskill House has a complicated planning history. The current administration indeed did inherit a scheme for this site and the site known as Watermeadow Court. This scheme, which has been mentioned, a joint venture with Stanhope, which if implemented would have delivered much needed high quality new housing across both sites, including 40% of both sites having affordable homes. However, the current administration chose to go down a different route and amended the scheme so that the Edith Summerskill House would provide 100% affordable homes and the site in Watermeadow Court would provide 0. This scheme was rightly rejected by the Labour Mayor for London, Sadiq Khan, reasoning that splitting social and private accommodation instead of blending them was a segregated approach which did not fit with the London plan. It is worth noting that while the Mayor was determining the application, fly tippers took advantage of delays over the site's future and dumped building waste at the vacant site. The site was subsequently cleared by the council, with Cabinet approving an additional payment of £563,000 at Cabinet on the 4th of June 2018 to do this. I do not recall the administration putting down a motion at this time criticising the Mayor for either using his step-in powers or the way he exercised his judgment on the application, even though it scuppered their plans and increased the council's costs significantly. After spending an additional £500,000 due to their failure to properly secure the site, they eventually secured planning permission for both sites, and in the case of Watermeadow Court, eventually agreed to build less than 20% affordable homes. However, at this point, the council terminated their joint venture with Stanhope at a cost of £3.49 million, although the council claimed this was a good deal because they had negotiated it down from £5 million. Turning to the recent planning history for Edith Summerskill House, again, this has been beset by delays, some of which have been the council's own fault. Planning permission was granted back in 2017, only to be quashed judicial review 2 years later. The review was brought by a local Fulham resident opposed to the scheme. Again, I do not recall the administration putting down a motion criticising the residents at the time for their role in delaying the 20-storey tower block. When the application was last assessed by the Planning Committee in September 2020, residents again objected on numerous grounds. This included the fact that the scheme did not adhere to the local plan, as the 20-storey building, which would be 20 metres higher than the previous building, was not located in an area that our own local plan stated was acceptable for tall buildings. Another local resident, Kate Lamont, told the committee there had been no public consultation since 2016. Council planning officers admitted this was true. Historic England also objected to the application, saying the skyscraper could cause serious harm to the setting of the Church of St. Thomas of Canterbury a Grade 2 listed heritage building. It is also worth noting that Labour members of the committee expressed concerns about the application. One stated, "I like this application in many ways, and I think we all support the public benefit of 100% affordable housing. I just wish it was being introduced in a tower block that was 20 metres shorter." This Labour councillor voted against granting planning consent. The motion before us tonight seeks to shift the blame from the council, who have failed comprehensively to deliver on this site for the past 7 years, to the government, who have simply exercised their rights to review the application. I would suggest that rather than waste time debating the motion, the council should, if they really want to work with residents rather than doing things to them, come up with a new scheme which has the local support and delivers high quality affordable homes, including outdoor amenity space. As many of us have learnt over the last year and a half, living in accommodation without access to outdoor private amenity space diminishes the value of a person's quality of life. The current
Councillor
scheme,
Thorley, just 1 minute.
Thank you very much. The current scheme fails to provide any private amenity space. Let's not repeat the mistakes of the past. I urge the council to reconsider this application and come back with a scheme that provides the housing we need and one that commands the residents' support. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Rowbottom.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We have lost many things during COVID. One of the things I miss most in my role as a councillor is the ability to knock on doors and speak to people. The last time that I was able to do this in my own ward of Fulham Broadway was in the September 2019 by-election in which I was elected. I spent many hours speaking to the community on the Clem Attlee estate, where the Edith Summerskill development, offering 133 genuinely affordable homes, was in train to be built. When I mentioned a scheme to residents on the Clem, particularly the fact that housing priority would be given to local people, you could see their eyes light up. This was a lifeline to them. I hope that the Secretary of State realises this. You learn a lot from meeting people in their homes and in the places where they live. As a councillor, you can advertise surgeries, attend events, and try and find proxies and ways to contact residents, but ultimately, nothing replaces knocking on doors and catching people one-to-one. You get to speak to people who you might not manage to reach any other way. Often, some of the most vulnerable residents who tell you about serious issues that affect their lives. The community living on the Clem are wonderful. They're warm, they're neighbourly, and they're proud of where they live. They include some of our residents who are most vulnerable and in need of support. They also include families who are living in very overcrowded housing and for whom the opportunity to move to a new flat in Edith Summerskill House was, as I say, a lifeline. I remember meeting a mother who had been sleeping on the sofa in her lounge for years while her 3 children shared a bedroom. She had peered round the door at me, untrusting and visibly stressed through enduring years of no personal space and knowing that worse was still to come. Her children were hurtling towards teenage years with no alternative to where they were living. I met several families with frustrated children in their 20s and their 30s who were still living in the family home. I remember their quiet resentment about having outgrown their life there, but being unable to afford to move anywhere nearby to give them the autonomy that they so wanted. Nearby to the estate, in temporary hostel accommodation, a father revealed the struggle that he'd had trying to hide his shame and his depression from his 5-year-old son, who he felt that he had failed as a father, unable to provide him, as he described it, with a home rather than just a roof over their heads. As the motion says, there are 105 temporarily housed households in a similar situation to this family who have so far been denied a permanent home by the government's decision. Mr. Mayor, we should also consider all the jobs and training which we were going to have opened up to local residents, many from the Clem Attlee estate itself, in building the new Edith Summerskill House. These remain unrealised thanks to the Secretary of State's decision. The space where the new Edith Summerskill House should be built stands empty and fenced off, a monument to what looks like political game playing and vindictiveness by this government.
Having seen hope light up residents' faces every time that they heard about these new homes being built for local people, it really is crushing to have to explain this delay and obstruction by the government, this denial of a chance of a better life. As we've heard from my colleagues, it is hard not to see the government's decision to call in this planning application as empty posturing, when you consider that our plan is the same size and scale as the one that the previous Conservative administration proposed for the site.
Councillor, 1 minute.
Thank you. The Secretary of State is also squandering public money by inflating the cost of delivering the scheme and risking running the entire financial viability into the ground. Mr. Mayor, I hope that all councillors, including the opposition, will support this motion. I hope that they will vote against the dashing of people's hopes and the waste of public money that the government call-in represents, and vote for giving 133 households the chance of a better life in new, genuinely affordable homes in the heart of Fulham. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Carmel.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do have to admit that when I first got my agenda and I saw this motion down here, I really was somewhat surprised at the time what appeared to me the effrontery of the Labour administration to bring forward this motion on this site. The history which my colleague Councillor Thorley has gone into in some details, I will just gently touch on a little bit more with a history of Watermeadow Court, which was so badly built because the then Labour administration crammed in more and more flats that it was known locally in Sands End as Goodman's Folly. The walls were so paper thin, and that was the reason why what could have been a beautiful housing that would have lasted for decades longer had to go. Your original scheme, as Councillor Thorley has said, was rejected by the GLA. This led to delays. When it came to planning committee, there was severe concern raised on the impact to the listed building of the grade, I think it's a grade 2 star, St. Thomas's Church on Ralston Road. And as I explained to the committee at the time, this is a church that I've had the opportunity many years ago, including into the priest's quarters, to examine and to observe the fact that it is undoubtedly the finest Pugian Catholic church in the country. Anyway, so far so good for the Labour administration. It was granted permission on a split vote. The next delay was caused by the council again. This led to the judicial review being brought by a local resident. The council didn't even bother to oppose the application for a judicial review, as far as I'm aware, and paid all his costs because of the council's error in delaying this project. No mention of what the costs were in that judicial review. More delays as a fresh consultation had to be carried out by the council. It had to eventually come back to committee. But, you know, over the years so far, the council-led delays are around, in my opinion, around 7 years. And it's a bit rich to complain about a perfectly legal process. Looking down at the points in the motion, the call-in purports to be on the grounds of a tall building, but the new building is of very similar height and dimensions to the building it replaces. I thought that's a bit odd. It didn't look like that on the CGIs when it came to committee, so I went and pulled up the old report. The old building, since the new building's over 80 meters tall, very similar height. Would anybody like to take a guess what height the building it seeks to replace was? No, under 60. So over 80, under 60. Very similar height. Don't think so. On dimensions, so I looked at the footprint of the building. This is measured in something called GEA, which stands for gross external area. The original building was
325 square meters GEA. The new building you're proposing is 718. That's nearly double the size. So now what's it doing? Oh, a very similar height and dimensions to the building it replaces. I think not. I think that you owe an apology to the mayor for, I'm sure it was unintentionally misleading him with that. You talk about
Councillor Carmel, you have one more minute.
Thank you very much. You talk about the costs of, amongst other things, security. How much did you spend on security and walking watches at Lannoy and Hartop, just a couple of 100 meters down the road? I mean, it's just ridiculous. This motion, in my opinion, is just pure political posturing. It's designed to cover up the delays caused by this Labour Council and trying to shift the blame, as you always do, back onto others. We will not support this ridiculous motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor. Does anybody else wish to speak on this item? I call on Councillor Jones to sum up.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, to echo a variation on the team, I have to say I find the opposition's bluster and diversion extremely disappointing. I mean, the two speeches we heard largely spent a lot of time talking about Watermeadow Court, which I'm happy to provide some of the history to, but has a very large amount to do with the history of the locked-in arrangements from the previous Conservative administration, which provided for no affordable housing whatsoever on the Watermeadow Court site. Just 11%, as I recall from record, although I could be wrong, of what I think was called the phrase discount market sale, which I've spoken about many times in this chamber, but basically equated to 80% of market value, which 90% of residents in this borough on average salary couldn't afford to buy. So the history of the joint venture, or the many things that the opposition said, is largely to do with an arrangement that this administration inherited, which provided for virtually no affordable housing on both sites and created a great deal of cost, time and constraint in terms of us fulfilling our manifesto pledge to build houses that residents of this borough could afford to live in. But I don't want to dwell on that, because I think I still want to not get into the rather sort of futile posturing and political issues. The bald facts of this, in my view, are unavoidable, okay? And as I set out before, I know that the building is taller than the proposal, the building that was there before, but there are 4 tall buildings on the Clement Attlee estate within line of sight of this building. At a personal level, I recognise that there are people who do not like tall buildings. This is a well-designed tall building with the same developer that the previous Conservative administration worked closely with and saw no objection to at the time. And it is extremely hard for the double standard of the opposition to say that what was fine when they brought it forward was not subsequently fine when it was brought forward under a different administration. The second thing in terms of cost is that this is a 4-year delay that is going to continue to cost this council millions of pounds. And ultimately, if planning consent is not granted, the net effect is what a smaller number of objectors around the planning application want, which is not a tall building, but low rise. And that means far fewer affordable houses for residents of this borough, where we have one of the longest housing waiting lists in the country, people in temporary accommodation and overcrowding. Essentially, this development is more or less the same as that brought forth by the previous Conservative administration. The only difference is the tenure of having genuinely affordable housing. And just to add to that, on Watermeadow Court, we are now at a situation, finally having reached a position where we will be able to bring forth a development that is at similar levels of genuinely affordable housing through various changes over the last few years in terms of the development options and the willingness of private developers to be involved in partnering arrangements. So overall, in summary, I will go back to what Councillor Colin Ahern said. This is a bad decision. There is no way around it. Taking 9 months to call in something that had been approved by the planning committee here, despite the ins and outs of the right discussion that the planning committee here had, and by the Mayor of London, and then taking 9 months to stop this at the 11th hour. There can be no, I think, defence of that position. It is a bad decision of government. There is a new Secretary of State, and I very much hope that the new Secretary of State will take a different view. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I'll now put the motion to the vote. Councillor Kwan, how does the Labour Group wish to vote on the motion?
Vote for the motion.
Vote for the motion. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Carmel, how does the Conservative Group wish to vote on the motion?
Mr. Mayor, the Conservative Group vote against the motion.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Does any member wish to vote differently? All right, I declare the motion carried. I move on to item 7.2, special motion 2, disabled access to tube stations in Hammersmith and Fulham. I call on the councillors Victoria Brocklebank Fowler and Councillor Amanda Lloyd Harris to move and second.
Formally moved.
Formally seconded.
Thank you. I call on Councillor Brocklebank Fowler, followed by Councillor Lloyd Harris, to speak for the opposition. Councillor Brocklebank Fowler.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've had to wait over 3 years to have this motion heard, and I tried 3 times in October 2018, January 2019, and obviously July this year, which didn't happen. It is a cause that is very close to my heart. The appalling lack of step-free access in our borough's tube stations is a real issue. And the reason I think for this situation is clear. It's the dreadful wishy-washy relationship between you as a Labour administration and the Labour London Mayor and TfL. This can be illustrated by the following, sometimes praising them and sometimes blaming them. The Hammersmith Bridge debacle, for example, no defensive bus service cuts, sneaking out the announcement of the cancellation of the Ravenscourt fireworks on the same day as the mayor cancels New Year's Eve fireworks. Just a few examples, and this motion is another one. Boris as mayor pushed ahead to make tube stations accessible. He understood the deeply felt need to be able to travel across our great city without feeling it was a battle every time. He tackled the expensive to renovate, architecturally difficult central London stations with high footfall, like Green Park, which cost £94 million. Sadiq Khan has instead concentrated on outer London stations, which are cheaper and easier to redesign. In central London, he did indeed finish off the last 10% of Victoria and Bond Street stations previously started under Boris. However, we now move to the most interesting of statistics, which reveals the failure of your administration. 66% of London boroughs are Labour controlled. 25% of London boroughs are Conservative controlled, with 9% Lib Dem. But by the end of this year, since Sadiq Khan became mayor in 2016, 81% of new step-free stations have been built in Labour boroughs. 81% in Labour boroughs, and yet LBHF has still failed to secure any new step-free stations. So, even under a mayor who has heavily favoured Labour boroughs, our Labour borough has not had a look in. This raises serious concerns for us residents as to your relationship with Sadiq Khan and TfL. Many believe you are a lame duck administration. On October the 11th, TfL put out a new consultation entitled, "How should TfL decide which stations to make step-free?" Within the body of this consultation is the statement, "We don't currently have funding to deliver more step-free stations. So yet again, you've missed the boat. So there we go. TfL can't, and you haven't. For 7 years now, you could have made this a priority, but you haven't. And disabled residents and families with young children and buggies have been denied the chance to travel easily and quickly. Just in case you'd not noticed, Greg Hands MP has been trying to help his residents in Fulham.
Sorry, councillor, one more minute.
Thank you. We were with him as he collected over 1,000 signatures in May this year, supporting step-free access in Parsons Green and Putney Bridge. Feeling is running high on this issue, with the conclusion being that your administration's on-off relationship with TfL has caused our borough to be left behind the rest of London. So to conclude, why does Sadiq Khan favour Labour Newham over Labour Hammersmith and Fulham?
Thank you, councillor. Councillor Amanda Lloyd-Harris.
Thank you, Mayor. Why is TfL disenfranchising people with disabilities? Every day in London, over 1.3 million journeys are made by people with various disabilities. The London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, promised, as Councillor Brockman-Fowler has already said, in 2006 to make London a more open and accessible city for all. But unfortunately, we're still waiting. How can all people live independent lives if they are denied access to transport? What happens if you need to commute to go to work? What, heaven forbid, happens when you might have family and friends in other boroughs? The Mayor's transport strategy plan in 2018 promised that 40% of all London underground stations would be accessible by 2022. But we're not there yet, or really even very close. Susan Hall's report on making London inclusive states, the reality is that the Mayor has only increased accessibility at London underground stations by 5% since 2016. Putney Bridge Tube is a case in point. It's run down with dangerous steps that the elderly and infirmed have to navigate. Calls for TfL for improvements have been ongoing for years, yet nothing is done. Why promise something that you're not going to deliver? I was visiting a disabled resident of mine last week over what can only be described as probably one of the most horrific stories I think I've heard, and housing situation that shouldn't be allowed to happen in 2021. He was told he would have to sleep in his wheelchair for 2 weeks whilst repairs are completed on his house. He's an ardent Chelsea fan, but is unable to access Putney Bridge Tube Station in its present configuration. I asked him what were his thoughts about it, as in the station, obviously, and the general services in the borough for those with disability. Now, the only printable comments were, and I apologise in advance for this, but they are the only printable ones, was bloody useless and utter bloody crap. This is one chap whose life is being seriously blighted by TfL's lack of action. This is where the council can come in and join with the Conservatives, petitioning the Mayor for London and TfL to upgrade the station urgently. We should not even be debating this, as residents want parties to work together and make the community better for everyone. Funding has previously been used as an excuse for failure to upgrade. Well, there is a Section 106 funds attached to the Fulham Football Club stand redevelopment. Whilst it's not a huge amount, 150,000 should not be sneezed at, has been earmarked to improve public transport at Putney Bridge Tube. If the funds have been spent, can the administration please confirm where it has been spent? If the money has not been, can the administration confirm it will be spent on what it is earmarked for? I've spoken to Chief Operating Officer at Fulham Football Club. He felt pretty good that we're going to use the money to improve access because it benefits so many people. Residents of all political persuasions want to believe and do believe that this is essential to have a step-free access for everyone at Putney Bridge Tube. It serves a wide area and it's been left behind, as have a number of others in our borough. which I'd have to say I find rather disappointing given the connection between a Labour administration and also obviously the Mayor for London. It seems now that TfL may be reacting to Greg Hand's and Tony Devonish's petitions demanding the upgrading.
Councillor, you have 1 more minute.
Thank you very much. Since it's been announced there will be a consultation in November. Whilst it is welcome, it does appear that it is long overdue and may not necessarily have the, we may not necessarily see the light of day at the end of it, but hopefully something will happen. I do believe it's time to work together, and I hope this administration will join with us in working together to make Hammersmith and Fulham a community for everyone, not just a few. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I've had notice that an amendment has been submitted for the motion, and I call on Councillors Coleman and Quigley to move and second the amendment.
Formally move, is that correct? Formally move.
Councillor Quigley?
Formally seconded.
Thank you. I call on Councillor Coleman, followed by Councillor Quigley, to speak to the administration.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have to say, when we put this amendment together, Councillor Quigley and I, we did so because we thought that the Conservative motion, while laudable on paper, was a bit sort of wet and thin and partial and missed what was really going on. However, we clearly missed what was going on. The passionate speech given by Councillor Brocklebank-Fowler makes it quite clear that what's on paper had nothing to do with her real intention, which is to make it quite honestly facile connection between TfL and this borough and what we're doing and why aren't doing, and why is it that no Conservative councils are getting any new stations, and I don't know, it was confusing, but it certainly didn't have anything to do with the motion. So I'm going to go back to what we thought the motion should be about and how we felt we could improve it so we could actually achieve something more intelligent and realistic with, we hope, your support for disabled residents and other residents in our borough who do need better step-free access than exists at the moment. And as you know, this administration is determined to make Hammersmith and Fulham the best borough for disabled people in the country, and it's determined to work in co-production with disabled people to remove the barriers that they face. And part of this obviously involves removing the barriers created by a lack of step-free access, both for disabled people and for older people and those with younger families. Now, it's true that while some of the stations in our borough have step-free access, too many others don't. And I couldn't help noticing that the Conservative motion focuses only on Fulham, and as everyone here knows, I think Fulham is fab. But let's remember that we are a borough of Hammersmith and Fulham and Shepherd's Bush. And of course, at the time of the redevelopment of the Shepherd's Bush station some years ago, when the Conservatives were in administration in Hammersmith and Fulham, and when Boris Johnson was the Mayor of London, neither the administration nor the Mayor of the time supported Andy Slaw, the local MP, and us in the Labour Party when we were insisting that step-free access to the station should form part of the redevelopment. We were just told it was, I think it was too expensive, which is something that we're now being criticised for the other way around. It wasn't too expensive, it just wasn't interesting, and it wouldn't have pushed things through for other reasons the way that the Mayor at the time wanted. So under a Labour Mayor, I think it is worth noting that TfL has done somewhat better. It has made 21 stations step-free in the past 5 years. And it is even planning to include that outer London borough Knightsbridge by next year. If you look at the freely available information which pops up within 2 seconds of doing a Google search. Just a suggestion. It is also, as you noted, going to be launching a consultation in November to help shape its future approach to step-free tube stations, should more funding become available. And I've been in communication with TfL about this, because sadly, funding, and this is where the government, I'm afraid, does come in and can't be avoided, funding has become a huge problem. Prior to the pandemic, TfL, as you probably know, was on track to deliver an operating surplus by 22-23, having reduced its net cost of operations by almost £1 billion over the past 4 years and increased its cash reserves to more than £2 billion, which is commendable. However, COVID, as we know, had a catastrophic effect. No one took the tube, and their finances suffered hugely, and the government stepped in and did not step in a generous way at all for the people of London. And the fact now is that without government support, TfL may still face a £500 million gap this year in its funding, a gap which is going to inhibit the installation of any more step-free access other than what's already planned at any more stations. So, Mr. Mayor, as an administration, We're going to be encouraging local residents and businesses and community groups to respond to the consultation which is forthcoming, to urge step-free access for more tube stations in our borough. We're going to be organising, there's an invitation from TfL to organise sessions directly with residents, and we're going to be trying to do that so TfL can hear directly about the problems caused by the lack of step-free access, with or without the fruity language employed by Councillor Lloyd Harris. But simply, Mr. Mayor, without funding, the fact is the barriers will remain. That's why in this motion, which we're trying to up, if you want, the ante a little bit more and give it some purpose and some teeth, we're calling on the government to engage fully with Transport for London to secure a proper long-term funding agreement that will enable TfL to fund step-free access to more stations in Hammersmith and Fulham, and of course, across London. So what I'd ask you all to do, if this is something you genuinely believe in, whether you've been battling about this for 3 years or longer, as I know my colleagues of mine have been, I'm asking you all, please, to strengthen our voice as a council, support our disabled and other residents, and vote for our amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Coleman, and thank you for the promotion. Now go on to Councillor Quigley.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor. As Rosie Jones would say, I'm proud to be a disabled woman and a Labour councillor. I say that because there are very few disabled politicians in elected office. So if you don't mind, tonight I'm going to take a few minutes trying to explain what it is like to face the barriers while using the tube in London. First of all, to put it in context, there are 270 tube stations in London, but only 81 of these are described by TfL has been step-free. Now, I don't want to make this political, but I'm somewhat surprised at the opposition blaming us for an issue that clearly is London-wide. Access to public transport is a basic right for everybody. We all should, in 2021, be able to pop onto the tube, or in my case, scoot on it. However, disabled people are facing increasing barriers of not being able to travel independently, door to door. Disabled people do not have the luxury of making mistakes when travelling on the tube, as it can lead to all sorts of difficulties. And I know this from very personal experience. I know what it's like to get off at a tube station and not be able to get out of a tube station, have to get back onto a tube and then go down a few tube stations to get off at a tube station that you can actually get out of the building, and then try to have to make your way back to a venue that you were supposed to originally be at. So it is a very real problem. I would have to plan my journey from beginning to end. I would have to check everything. If I needed to change tube, then I need to make sure that the station is accessible, number one, and that I can make it onto a connecting tube. It takes precision and thought and can sometimes go wrong. Most of the time I end up using taxis simply because I do not have the energy or mental capacity to be able to try and plan a tube ride. As you know, Mr. Mayor, I can be feisty at times and I don't give up. But when it goes wrong on the tube, it can be just so it can be it can be very upsetting. But when it goes right, and when you can go from door to door, the independence. I am a woman, I'm a 55-year-old woman. I'm in elected office. I scoot around Hammersmith, as you know. I've got now more paraphernalia to take around with me. I still want to live this independent life, and we need to get this right. But you know, I would ask the opposition to please vote on this with us. I worked hard with Councillor Coleman on this amendment because I feel very strongly about it. Also, disabled people's spending power is worth 274 billion. Now, a proportion of that obviously would go into London. I think we just all need to come together. And I find it hurtful that a member of the opposition referred to us as lame ducks. I am not a lame duck. I work for my constituents. I was on the Disabled People's Commission. So I work very hard to get this done. And I hope that everybody will vote in favour of this amendment. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Are there any other speakers on this amendment? Councillor Belinda Donovan?
Oh, sorry. I hope you can hear me okay. I wanted to vote to speak on the original motion.
Yes, we can hear you, and it's now the time to do that. So please.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Those of us in the community who are wheelchair bound especially enjoy an outing, a chance to venture out with a carer and really enjoy yourself for once. Having had my mother, who suffered from Parkinson's, living with me for the last year of her life, I have been that carer and have had personal experience of the extreme anguish it can bring when planning trips to find how few lifts there are out there in our local underground stations. Not everyone can afford taxis and Ubers. Besides, they are often badly equipped to cope with wheelchairs in their boots, sometimes refusing to take wheelchairs at all. And more to the point, one should be able to take advantage of senior travel cards. I've also been privileged to get to know well a couple of disabled residents with wheelchairs who told me that they impoverished themselves by using taxis when they really did not want to, especially to attend doctor's appointments because of the lack of lifts on our undergrounds. One in particular was very tearful only a month before she sadly died of COVID, and this speech is in her memory. I could see how distressed she was. Money for taxis had become such an issue for her because of the lack of accessible underground stations that it dominated her final days very tragically. There must be many of us here tonight, including myself as a mother of 3 now grown-up kids, who have struggled with a toddler under one arm and a pushchair under the other, thinking very uncharitable thoughts about TfL as there was no lift available. I gather too that there have been more accidents than usual as we emerge out of lockdowns on the underground, as people are understandably wary of using the handrail, as they worry that they or their family might catch the virus from handling underground surfaces. So it is now arguably even more dangerous to try and go on escalators when only a lift will really do. I ask that the administration today lobby TfL as a matter of extreme urgency to make life for our disabled residents, with or without wheelchairs, parents and their families, especially babies and toddlers, so much easier with lifts thoughtfully placed at Putney Bridge, Parsons Green and Barons Court tube stations. This is not a luxury, but a necessity, especially for those who I know we have all seen struggling on the way to or from work, taking their kids to or from childminders, often at very antisocial hours, looking exhausted. Please make our local tube stations step-free as an utmost priority. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Harcourt.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As many colleagues in this chamber, or this particular room, whatever you want to call it, have said previously, I hadn't intended speaking on this particular issue. It is something that I've been very much aware of for a good many years, going back to the days, if you recall, former councillor Reg McLaughlin, who was a major champion of disabled people in this borough.
I remember him when he was a cabinet member and how he went out and he did an audit. He was commissioned to do an audit of accessibility of stations through London, something he was very proud of. However, sadly, nothing came to fruition on this. I recall also when we had a public meeting in the small hall back in the town hall, God knows how many years ago it was now, when Tim O'Toole, the Canadian guy who was the chief exec of TfL at the time, turned up to listen to complaints. And I raised the point then about the need for step-free access to tube stations. And the point that was being made was that, you know, there's much easier, it's cheaper, it's more convenient to be able to make step-free access to tube stations in the outer parts of London for obvious reasons. But why should disabled people be limited only to outer London? Surely disabled people have every much a right to go into Covent Garden or to go into the centre of London as anybody else. And, you know, it's an absolute nightmare with just no access in those areas. You know, in terms of disabled people, as Councillor Coleman and Councillor Quigley have both said, we are determined in this borough to champion disabled people and disabled people's rights, and the co-production that we've been doing with them is part of that. Councillor Cassidy mentioned earlier that, you know, we just won an award for the work we've been doing with cycling and disabled people. So that's another point that's there. But, you know, I think these are things that we need to look at. I sit on the London Council's Transport and Environment Committee, London Council's Transport and Environment Committee. And occasionally things about disabled people come up there, things like dial-a-ride, taxi card, and so on. And every time that comes up, I make the point absolutely as vigorously as I possibly can about the need for disabled access. And taxi cars, another one of these areas that needs improving. So it's not just about getting step-free access in our tube stations, it's making sure that other facilities that are available for disabled people, like, as I say, taxi car, dial-a-ride, and other services, actually provide the service so that disabled people can live as well, good a life as the rest of us and have access to all the same facilities as all the rest of us have as well. So, you know, I'm here, I'm supporting this amendment that we've written here, and I will continue, as I'm sure this administration will, to support the needs and the rights of disabled people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I'll now put the amendment to the vote. Councillor Kwan, how does the Labour Group wish to vote on the amendment?
We're voting for the amendment.
Councillor Carmel, how does the Conservative Group wish to vote on the amendment?
We're voting against the amendment.
Voting against. Do any members wish to vote differently? I declare the amendment carried.
Mr. Mayor, can I give you notice that under Standing Order 25, 3 hours has now elapsed from the start of the meeting and the guillotine provisions are now in effect.
I was aware of that. Thank you, Councillor. That's the monitoring officer's job. But thank you. If I just move on now, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Councillor. Thank you very much indeed, Councillor. And I'm now going to call on Councillor Brocklebank-Fowler to, the guillotine is now fallen, of course, to sum up, if you would.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Unfortunately, I am not convinced about what I've heard from the administration. It's taken a long time to bring this motion, and we weren't allowed to speak to it before. So I rather assume that it was very low priority for you. However, I can hear that obviously you do think it's important. It's just very sad. If I quote the words of Alan Benson, who is the chairman of Transport for All, he's an electric wheelchair user, and he argues that many disabled and older people, and I quote, are locked out from using the tube. He continues, it stops us from getting to work or university, from seeing friends and family, or just living our lives like everyone else. Now, the point is, there are other options, but to be able to use the tube is the quickest the fastest, the cheapest crossing London, going wherever you want to go. But if you're disabled, a journey can take forever. You know, coming from Fulham to our old town hall, Hammersmith Town Hall, would take an extra 40 minutes if you were disabled and had no wheelchair support, because there are no steps. You'd have to spend a long time on your journey. And it's the added expense. And I just think that given, you know, that you've claimed that you've got so much Section 106 and SIL money and so on, that this, you know, could have been used to help, you know, make these stations better. And we covered Barron's Court, and I was going to list them all in the motion, but it seemed rather absurd. Anybody looking at the map can see that we have very, very few that have a lift. So I'm delighted if you're going to take this seriously. It's just, it's taken 7 years. You know, I really would like some action on this. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I'll now put the amended motion to the vote. Councillor Kwan, how does the Labour Group wish to vote?
Be voting for.
Voting for the motion. Councillor Carmel, how does the Conservative Group wish to vote?
We're voting against.
Voting against the moment. Does any member wish to vote differently? No. Okay, I declare the amended motion has been carried. I've been advised that all outstanding motions have been withdrawn. So that brings our meeting to an end this evening. I hope you have a terrific evening. And also it's great to see some faces back here again. Thank you very much, everyone.